A 10-year-old boy stands alone beside a rusted gas pump in the freezing Wyoming rain, clutching a loaf of bread like it's the last thing keeping him alive. Because it might be. His mother is inside counting crumpled dollar bills that won't cover what they owe. His father is dead. The system has already forgotten them. And then, from the darkness of a flooded highway, a sound rises like a warning from the edge of the world. A black Harley rolling through the storm, carrying a scarred man who once rode beside the boy's father. What happens next will shatter everything this family believed about danger, loyalty, and the men they were taught to fear. Stay until the very end. This story will wreck you. If it hits you, smash that like button and drop your city in the comments. Let's ride. The rain didn't fall on Black Hollow, Wyoming. It attacked. Cold November sheets hammered the cracked asphalt of Route 191 like something personal, flooding the drainage ditches that hadn't been cleared since the county cut maintenance funding 3 years ago. The only gas station for 40 miles sat at the junction where the highway bent north toward the mountains. A sagging structure called Dale's Fill and Go, though Dale himself had been dead since 2014 and nobody bothered changing the sign. The neon buzzed a sick orange against the darkness. One pump worked. The fluorescent light above the entrance flickered with the patience of something dying slowly. Eli Mercer stood beneath that light, 10 years old, holding a plastic bag with a loaf of white bread and a jar of peanut butter he wasn't sure his mother could afford. His sneakers were soaked through. His jacket, a hand-me-down from a church donation bin 2 sizes too big, hung off his thin shoulders like a collapsed tent. He didn't shiver anymore. He'd stopped shivering an hour ago, which was worse, though he didn't know that yet. Inside the gas station, through the smeared glass door, his mother Claire stood at the counter arguing quietly with a clerk who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on the planet. She was counting bills, 1s and 5s mostly, a few quarters stacked beside her elbow. The total on the register read $23.47. She had $19.60 spread across the counter like evidence of a crime she couldn't stop committing. Eli watched her lips move. He couldn't hear what she was saying, but he knew the shape of it. He'd memorized it the way other kids memorize song lyrics. I get paid Friday. I can come back. Please. I just need the bread and the gas. Please. The clerk shook his head. Claire's shoulders dropped an inch. Just 1 inch. But Eli saw it, because he'd been measuring his mother's collapse in inches for 2 years now. Ever since his father's motorcycle went under a logging truck on a mountain road outside Cody and turned Mason Mercer into a name people whispered instead of spoke. The bread was $3.89. The gas was $19 even. She was short. Eli looked down at the peanut butter in the bag. Put it back, he thought. If she puts it back, they can cover the gas. If they cover the gas, they can drive home. If they drive home, she can sleep. If she sleeps, maybe tomorrow won't be this bad. He pushed through the door and set the peanut butter jar on the counter without a word. Claire looked at him. Her eyes were red but dry. She'd trained herself out of crying in public 18 months ago, somewhere between the 3rd collection notice and the 1st eviction warning. We don't need it, Eli said. Claire stared at the jar, then at her son, then at the clerk who was already recalculating the total with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd seen this scene 100 times and learned not to feel anything about it. That's $19.58, the clerk said. You're covered. Claire paid. She didn't say thank you. Neither did the clerk. Eli picked up the bread and walked back outside into the rain, because the fluorescent light inside made his eyes hurt, and because standing next to his mother while she swallowed that particular kind of shame felt like watching someone bleed from a wound he couldn't reach. He stood by the pump while she filled the tank of their 2004 Honda Civic, a car that burned oil, pulled left, and had a heater that worked only when it felt like it. Tonight it didn't feel like it. The rain intensified. Eli tucked the bread under his jacket to keep it dry. The bread was more important than he was. The bread was dinner and tomorrow's lunch and maybe the day after if they stretched it thin enough. That's when he heard it. Low at first, a vibration more than a sound, something that traveled through the wet asphalt and up through his soaked sneakers and into his chest before his ears even registered it. Then it grew, a deep guttural rumble that split the rain like a blade parting cloth. Headlights cut through the darkness from the south end of the highway. One beam, not two. A single machine. The motorcycle materialized out of the storm like something summoned rather than driven. A black Harley-Davidson Road King, older model, heavy with road wear. The chrome was dulled by miles and weather. The saddlebags were scarred with scratches that looked deliberate, like someone had dragged the bike across gravel more than once. The rider wore black leather so rain-darkened it looked like oil, a half-helmet that exposed a jaw covered in gray stubble, and boots that had walked through more trouble than most people could survive. He pulled into the station and killed the engine beside the second pump, the broken one, though he didn't seem to care about fuel. The silence after the engine died was enormous. The rain filled it immediately, but something about the absence of that sound left a vacuum that made Eli's skin tighten. The rider sat on the bike for a long moment, rain streaming off his shoulders, staring at nothing. Then he swung one leg over and stood, and Eli realized the man was tall. Not dramatically, but in the way that certain people take up space beyond their physical dimensions. His face was weathered and hard, carved by wind and highway sun into something that looked more like landscape than flesh. A scar ran from his left eyebrow to his jawline, old and white, the kind that came from something fast and sharp and never talked about. His leather vest, his cut, though Eli didn't know that word yet, bore patches that Eli couldn't read in the dim light. A name across the back. A symbol. Territory markers for a world Eli had never entered and his mother had spent years running from. The man looked at Eli. Eli looked back. Neither of them spoke. The rain hammered between them like static. Then the man glanced at the bread tucked under Eli's jacket, at the boy's soaked sneakers, at the oversized coat hanging off shoulders too thin for a 10-year-old. Something moved behind his eyes. Not pity, which Eli would have recognized and hated, but something heavier. Recognition, maybe. The particular expression of a man who understood hunger not as a concept, but as a memory written in his own bones. "Rough night," the man said. His voice was low, abraded, like gravel dragged across iron. "Yes, sir," Eli said, because Claire had taught him manners even when everything else was falling apart. The man almost smiled. Almost. "Nobody's called me sir since I got out of the service. You waiting on someone?" "My mom." Eli nodded toward the car. Claire was watching through the rain-streaked windshield, her face tight with the particular tension of a woman calculating threat levels in real time. The man followed Eli's gaze, looked at the car, looked at the boy again. "What's your name, kid?" "Eli. Eli Mercer." The name landed like a bullet. The man's entire body changed. Not dramatically. He didn't stumble, didn't gasp, didn't do any of the things people do in movies when they hear something shocking. But the stillness that overtook him was absolute. His hands, which had been reaching for his jacket pocket, stopped midair. His jaw locked. His eyes, gray and sharp, and already hard, went somewhere else entirely. Somewhere years behind them, buried under road dust and engine smoke, and a grief so compressed it had turned to stone inside his chest. The rain fell. The neon buzzed. Eli watched the man's face and felt something cold that had nothing to do with the weather. He'd said something wrong. He'd broken something just by existing. "Mercer," the man repeated. Not a question. A confirmation. Like he was checking the word against something filed deep in his memory and finding it exactly where he'd left it. "Your daddy's name Mason?" Eli's throat closed. He nodded. The man exhaled, a long, controlled breath that fogged in the freezing air and dissolved into the rain. He looked away, toward the empty highway, toward the mountains invisible behind the storm. When he looked back, his eyes were wet, though that could have been the rain. With a man like this, you'd never know. "I rode with your old man," he said quietly, "for 6 years. My name's Wade. Wade Rourke." The name meant nothing to Eli, but the way Wade said your old man meant everything. Not with the careful, sanitized sympathy of counselors and caseworkers and teachers who said, "I'm sorry for your loss," like they were reading from a script, but with the rough familiarity of someone who had actually known the man, who had sat beside him, eaten with him, ridden with him through weather worse than this. "He used to sing," Wade said, and the corner of his mouth twitched, the ghost of a memory fighting through years of scar tissue. Terrible, absolutely terrible. Murdered every classic rock song ever written while he was elbow deep in a carburetor. Couldn't carry a tune if you bolted it to his handlebars. Eli felt something crack open inside his chest. Not pain. He knew pain, had lived inside it so long it felt like furniture. This was different. This was a door opening into a room he'd forgotten existed. A room where his father wasn't a tragedy. Where Mason Mercer was a man who sang badly and fixed engines and made other men laugh. He really couldn't sing? Eli asked, and his voice came out smaller than he wanted. Kid, your father once cleared an entire diner at 2 a.m. trying to do Lynyrd Skynyrd. The cook threatened to call the cops. Not because of the bikes, because of the singing. Eli laughed. The sound surprised both of them. It rose out of the rain and the cold and the fluorescent decay of the gas station, like something that had been buried alive and just clawed its way to the surface. It was short and raw, and it ended almost immediately. But it existed. It had happened. And Wade Rourke, a man who had not cried in 7 years, who had buried friends and broken bones and ridden through darkness that would have destroyed softer men, felt his throat tighten at the sound of a dead man's son laughing for what was clearly the first time in a very long time. The car door opened. Claire Mercer stepped out into the rain with the energy of a woman who had already decided how this encounter was going to end. Her scrubs were wrinkled from a 12-hour nursing shift. Her hair was pulled back so tight it looked painful. Her eyes locked onto Wade's leather cut, onto the patches, onto the scars, onto everything she had spent the last 2 years trying to erase from her life and her son's memory. Eli, car, now! Her voice was flat and final. The voice of a woman who had learned that showing emotion in front of dangerous people was a luxury she could no longer afford. Mom, he knew Dad? Car, now! Eli looked at Wade. Wade looked at Claire. The rain stood between all of them like a wall nobody had asked for. Ma'am, Wade started. Don't. Claire's hand found Eli's shoulder and pulled him toward the Civic with a grip that was protective and desperate in equal measure. I know what that patch means. I know what that club is. And I know what it cost my husband. So whatever you're selling, whatever brotherhood speech you've got loaded up, save it. I buried that life when I buried Mason. Wade didn't move, didn't argue, didn't raise his voice or step forward or do anything that could be interpreted as aggression. He just stood in the rain with his hands visible at his sides and let Claire Mercer pour 2 years of fury and fear onto the cracked asphalt between them. I'm not selling anything, he said when she finished. I didn't know Mason had a son. Nobody at the club did. He never said. That stopped her. Not because it was comforting, but because it confirmed something she'd always suspected, that Mason had kept his family separate from his riding life. Not out of shame, but out of protection. That the wall between those two worlds had been deliberate. That when the wall collapsed and killed him, it had fallen on her and Eli alone. Good, Claire said, but her voice fractured on the word. Then there's nothing to talk about. She put Eli in the car. She got behind the wheel. The engine coughed twice before catching, and the Civic pulled out of the station with its one working taillight bleeding red into the storm. Wade Rourke stood beside his Harley in the rain and watched them disappear. He didn't move for a long time. The neon above the gas station flickered once, twice, and went dark. The only light left was the thin glow from inside the store where the clerk had already gone back to his phone, indifferent to the small human catastrophe that had just played out beside pump number 1. Wade pulled out his phone. Rainwater smeared across the cracked screen as he scrolled through contacts until he found a name he hadn't called in months. The line rang 4 times before a voice answered. Rough, tired, the voice of a man who slept poorly and woke angry. It's 2 a.m, Wade. Mason had a kid. Silence. Then the sound of a body sitting up in bed, springs creaking under weight. Say that again. A boy, 10. Maybe 11. Name's Eli. Lives here in Black Hollow with his mother, Claire. She's working nursing shifts, barely keeping the lights on. The kid was standing in the rain outside Dale's old station, holding a loaf of bread, like it was the last thing he owned. More silence. Then, how'd you find out? The kid told me his name. I didn't go looking. He was just standing there. A long exhale on the other end. Wade could hear the man thinking. could practically hear the gears turning in a mind that had spent decades calculating risk and loyalty and the invisible mathematics of obligation. Mason never told us. I know. He kept them hidden. I know that too. Claire, she the nurse? Small woman, dark hair, looks like she hasn't slept since the Clinton administration? That's her? Another pause. When the voice came back, it was quieter, careful. She doesn't want anything to do with us. No, she made that real clear. Can't blame her. I'm not blaming her. I'm telling you the situation. The kid is hungry, Garrett. The car's falling apart. She's drowning, and there's nobody throwing her a line because Mason kept everything separate. And when he died, the separation became permanent. The man on the other end, Garrett Dunn, 58 years old, president of the Iron Hollow Motorcycle Club for the last 11 years, was quiet for so long that Wade checked his phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. We failed him, Garrett finally said. We buried Mason, and we toasted him, and we put his picture on the wall, and the whole time his family was starving 40 miles from the clubhouse. Yes, that ends now. She won't accept help. Not from us. Then we don't ask permission. We figure out what needs doing, and we do it quiet. The way Mason would have done it for any of us. Wade looked at the empty highway where the Civic's taillight had vanished. The rain was letting up slightly, the clouds thinning enough to suggest that somewhere behind them, stars still existed. There's something else, Wade said. What? The boy. When I told him about Mason singing in that diner, the story about the cook threatening to call the law, the kid laughed, and I mean laughed, like he'd been holding his breath for 2 years and somebody finally told him it was okay to exhale. Garrett said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the particular roughness of a man fighting something he didn't want to name. We'll be there tomorrow, all of us. Don't approach the mother again until I get there. Last thing she needs is more leather showing up unannounced. Copy. And Wade. Yeah. Don't disappear on this one. I know how you get. I know what happened with your own... He stopped. The silence that filled the gap was sharp enough to cut. Just don't disappear. Wade ended the call without answering. He stood alone at the dead gas station for another 10 minutes, rain dripping off his jacket onto concrete that smelled like old oil and regret. Then he mounted the Harley, kicked the engine alive, and rode north into the storm toward a clubhouse that sat at the end of a gravel road surrounded by pine trees and rust and the accumulated weight of men who had survived things they couldn't talk about. The clubhouse wasn't a building, it was an agreement, a converted warehouse at the edge of Black Hollow's industrial district, if you could call 3 abandoned buildings and a defunct lumber mill a district. The corrugated walls were painted flat black years ago, now fading to the color of old bruises. Inside, a bar made from reclaimed railroad ties, a pool table with a torn felt surface, a garage bay large enough for 6 bikes, and the constant smell of chain lube, burnt coffee, and the particular musk of leather that had been worn through heat and cold and every kind of weather a Wyoming sky could manufacture. Wade parked his bike inside the bay and pulled the rolling door shut against the rain. The garage was empty except for 2 machines, a stripped-down Sportster someone was rebuilding, and an older Softail that belonged to a dead man whose family never came to collect it. He hung his wet jacket on a hook beside a pegboard covered in wrenches and socket sets, and a single photograph pinned with a thumbtack. 5 men standing in front of their bikes on a mountain road, squinting against the sun. Mason Mercer was second from the left, grinning like a man who believed he was immortal. Wade stared at the photograph. "You son of a bitch," he said quietly. "You had a kid and you didn't tell us." The photograph didn't answer. Mason's grin stayed frozen, permanent, untouchable by the years of damage that had followed his death. Wade made coffee. The machine was ancient, the filter was stained, and the result tasted like it had been brewed in a transmission pan. But it was hot, and it was something to hold while the rain hammered the tin roof, and his mind replayed the image of Eli Mercer standing under that flickering neon light, with bread under his jacket, and old grief living behind eyes too young to carry it. He sat on an overturned crate in the garage and drank the coffee and didn't sleep. At some point during the night, the rain stopped. The silence that replaced it was worse, heavy and expectant, the kind of silence that exists before something irreversible begins. Wade knew that silence. He'd heard it before roadside accidents, before bar fights that ended in ambulances, before the phone call 3 years ago that told him his own daughter had stopped returning his calls permanently. Not because she was dead, but because she'd decided he was. Some losses you bury, others bury you. By dawn, the sky over Black Hollow had turned the color of dirty steel. Wade was on his third pot of coffee and his second cigarette when the first rumble reached him. Distant, then closer, then unmistakable. Bikes. Multiple engines approaching from the south on the gravel road, the sound building like a slow-motion avalanche of chrome and combustion. Garrett Dunn arrived first on a road-worn electric glide that looked like it had crossed the country twice and never been washed. Behind him came 3 others. Holt, a former Army medic with a prosthetic left hand and eyes that never quite focused on the present. Briggs, a massive bearded man who spoke so rarely that some newer members genuinely believed he was mute. And Dutch, the youngest of the old guard at 44, who ran the club's legitimate motorcycle repair shop and had a talent for making broken things work again that extended well beyond engines. They parked in the bay beside Wade's bike. Garrett killed his engine and sat for a moment, hands resting on the handlebars, reading the air the way he always did before walking into a situation. He was not a large man, 5'10", lean, gray hair cropped close to a skull that bore its own collection of scars. But he carried authority the way old trees carry weight, silently, structurally, from the roots. "Where's the family, sir?" Garrett asked without preamble. "Other side of town, rental house on Garfield Street. I drove past on my way back last night. Porch lights out, yard's dead. Neighbors have a foreclosure sign." "You scoped the house?" "Didn't stop? Didn't want to spook her." Garrett nodded. He dismounted and walked into the garage, past the bikes, past the bar, to the photograph on the pegboard. He studied it the way a man studies a map he should have read years ago. "Mason kept them hidden because he was protecting them from this life," Garrett said. "I understand that. I respect it. But Mason's dead, and the protection died with him, and now his boy is standing in the rain buying bread with money his mother doesn't have." He turned to face the others. "So here's what happens. We find out what they need. We provide it. We don't make speeches. We don't wear our cuts when we show up. We don't scare a woman who's already been scared enough. We just do the work." "And if she tells us to leave?" Holt asked, flexing the mechanical fingers of his prosthetic, a nervous habit he'd never been able to break. "Then we leave. And we come back the next day. And the day after that. Because that's what Mason would have done for any of our families, and we all know it." Nobody argued. Nobody needed to. The math was simple, psyched, brutal in its simplicity, actually. They had failed a brother's family for 2 years through ignorance, and ignorance had just expired. Wade poured coffee for everyone. They sat in the garage surrounded by the smell of oil and cold steel and planned how to approach a woman who wanted nothing to do with them on behalf of a dead man who had loved them enough to keep his family secret. None of them mentioned what they were all thinking, that this wasn't just about Mason's kid, that every man in that room was carrying his own version of the same wound, the particular failure of men who know how to protect strangers but couldn't save the people closest to them. Holt hadn't spoken to his ex-wife in 4 years. Briggs had a son in Cheyenne who changed his last name. Dutch's mother died in a nursing home he'd visited exactly twice. And Garrett had buried his own daughter 6 years ago, not from violence, but from an illness that took her slowly while he watched from a chair beside her hospital bed, powerless in a way that no amount of road miles or brotherhood could fix. They were damaged men, every one of them, held together by routine, by engines, by the unspoken agreement that showing up for each other was the only form of redemption available to people who had run out of second chances everywhere else. And now there was a boy with his father's name and his mother's exhaustion and a loaf of bread under his jacket in the rain. The morning light crept across the garage floor, pale and thin, illuminating the oil stains on the concrete like ancient maps of places that no longer existed. Garrett finished his coffee and stood. "Wade, your point on this. You made contact, you know the boy's face, he responded to you, but you move slow, you hear me? Glacier slow. That woman's been surviving alone for 2 years, and the last thing she'll trust Is a group of bikers showing up with good intentions and familiar patches. Wade nodded. One more thing, Garrett said, and his voice dropped to the register he used when he was about to say something that cost him. I called county services last night after you rang me, just to check, see what kind of support the Mercer family was getting. The garage went quiet. Even the coffee machine stopped its gurgling. And? Claire applied for assistance 7 months ago. Got denied. Applied again 4 months ago. Got denied again. Reason listed both times. Insufficient documentation of need. Garrett's jaw tightened. She's a full-time nurse making $14 an hour with a kid in public school and medical bills from Mason's accident that nobody ever settled, and the county decided she didn't demonstrate sufficient need. Holt set his coffee down carefully. Briggs, who hadn't spoken all morning, made a sound in his throat that wasn't quite a word but communicated more than most sentences. The system looked at that woman and her son, Garrett said, and decided they weren't desperate enough to help. So now it's on us, because nobody else is coming. The words hung as a cold garage air like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. Nobody else is coming. Wade thought about Eli standing under the neon, about the bread, about the laugh, that sudden, startled, impossibly alive sound erupting from a kid who had been drowning in silence for years, and about what Claire had said, her voice cracking on a single word. Good. As if the fact that Mason had kept his son hidden from the Brotherhood was the only victory she had left. The only wall still standing between her boy and the world that had killed his father. She didn't know yet that the wall was already crumbling, that her son had laughed with a stranger in a leather jacket in the rain, and that the sound had opened something that couldn't be closed again, that the boy had already begun reaching toward a world she'd spent 2 years trying to destroy. And she didn't know the thing that Wade hadn't told Garrett yet, the thing he'd noticed in the 30 seconds before Claire had pulled Eli away from the gas station. The detail that had been turning in his mind all night like a blade rotating slowly in a lock. Eli's jacket, the oversized donation bin coat hanging off his shoulders, had a bruise visible beneath the collar. Not from a fall, not from playground roughness. A fingerprint bruise, 4 distinct ovals pressed into the skin above his collarbone, the kind of mark left by an adult hand gripping hard enough to leave evidence. Someone was hurting Mason Mercer's son. And Wade Rourke, who had failed his own daughter in every way a father could fail, who had ridden away from his own wreckage and never looked back, who had spent 3 years punishing himself with silence and highway miles and the slow corrosion of unspoken guilt. Wade Rourke was not going to ride away from this. Not this time. The engines outside cooled and ticked in the morning air. Inside the garage, 4 damaged men sat in silence, drinking bad coffee, staring at a photograph of a dead friend who had kept his greatest secret hidden behind a grin that would never fade. And 40 miles south, in a rented house with a dead porch light on a street lined with foreclosure signs, Eli Mercer lay awake in a narrow bed listening to his mother cry through the thin wall between their rooms, and thought about a scarred man in the rain who had laughed while saying his father's name. It was the first time in 2 years that the thought of his father hadn't made him want to disappear. He didn't know it yet, but the thunder was coming back for him. The bruise changed everything. Wade sat in the garage for 3 hours after the others left, staring at the photograph of Mason on the pegboard and replaying those 30 seconds at the gas station in forensic detail. The way Eli had shifted when the wind pushed his collar sideways. The 4 oval marks pressed into the skin above his collarbone. Not random, not accidental, not the kind of mark a kid gets falling off a bicycle or roughhousing at recess. Deliberate, measured. The geometry of an adult hand closing around a child's shoulder with intent. He hadn't told Garrett. Not yet. Because telling Garrett meant activating something that couldn't be deactivated, and Wade needed to be sure before he lit that fuse. Garrett Dunn operated on a simple moral architecture. You protect those who can't protect themselves, and if someone is hurting a child, you remove the threat. The method of removal was where things got complicated, and where the line between protector and predator blurred into something the law wouldn't forgive. Wade poured cold coffee down the garage sink and watched it swirl through rust stains. His hands were steady. They were always steady. That was the problem. Steady hands, broken everything else. He pulled on a clean jacket. No patches, no cut. Just a plain brown canvas coat that made him look like any other weathered ranch hand in Wyoming. and rode into town on a truck he borrowed from Dutch's shop instead of the Harley. The bike would announce him. The truck would make him invisible. And right now, invisible was exactly what Mason Mercer's son needed him to be. Black Hollow in daylight looked worse than Black Hollow in the rain. The town had been dying for 15 years, slowly bled out by mine closures and highway reroutes, and the steady migration of anyone under 30 toward cities that still had functioning economies. Main Street was a museum of failure, a hardware store with a closing sale sign so sun-faded it had become permanent, a diner called Rosie's that served coffee strong enough to strip paint, a laundromat with 2 working machines out of 6, and a county services office that kept banker's hours and closed for lunch. Wade parked across the street from Garfield and watched. The Mercer house was the third from the end of a block that looked like it had given up. Small, single-story, white paint peeling off clapboard siding in long strips that curled like dead skin. The porch sagged on the left side where a support post had rotted through. A window on the east wall was patched with cardboard and duct tape. The yard was dirt and dead grass and a single plastic chair lying on its side from last night's wind. Claire's Civic was gone. Shift at the hospital, Wade figured, which meant Eli was either at school or alone in that house. He waited, watched the street. At 7:40, a yellow school bus rattled past and stopped 2 blocks north. Eli appeared from the house wearing the same oversized jacket, backpack hanging off one shoulder, walking with the particular hunch of a kid who'd learned to make himself small. He climbed onto the bus without looking at anyone. The bus pulled away, trailing blue exhaust. Wade noted the time, noted the school's direction, noted that nobody walked Eli to the bus, noted that the boy had emerged from the house alone, which meant Claire was already at work, which meant Eli had gotten himself up, dressed himself, fed himself whatever was available, bread and nothing probably, and walked himself to the bus stop in the cold. At 10 years old. He was about to pull away when movement caught his eye. A truck. Newer than anything else on the street, a silver Dodge Ram with aftermarket wheels and a dealer plate frame from Cody pulled into the Mercer driveway. A man got out, tall, broad, wearing a canvas work jacket and jeans that looked too clean for someone who actually worked. Mid-40s, maybe. Short hair, thick neck, the posture of someone who expected the world to move around him rather than the other way. The man walked to the front door. Didn't knock. Used a key. Wade's jaw tightened. He watched the man enter the house and close the door behind him. Through the cardboard-patched window, a light came on, then off, then on again in a different room. The man was inside for 11 minutes. Wade counted. When he came back out, he was carrying a small cardboard box and what looked like a stack of mail. He tossed both into the bed of his truck, stood in the driveway for a moment looking at the house with an expression Wade couldn't read from this distance, then drove away heading north. Wade memorized the plate number, wrote it on the back of a gas receipt with a pencil stub he found in the truck's console. Then he sat for another 20 minutes, waiting for his pulse to slow, waiting for the heat behind his eyes to cool into something he could control. Someone had a key to Claire Mercer's house. Someone who drove a truck that cost more than Claire made in a year. Someone who let himself in while she was at work, and her son was at school and helped himself to whatever he wanted. This wasn't finished. This was barely started. By noon, Wade was back at the clubhouse. Garrett was in the office, a glorified closet off the main room with a metal desk, a filing cabinet, and a window that looked out onto the gravel lot where the bikes were parked. He was on the phone when Wade walked in, but he read Wade's face and ended the call mid-sentence. What happened? Wade sat down in the folding chair across from the desk, placed the gas receipt with the plate number on the metal surface between them. Someone has a key to Claire's house. Silver Dodge Ram, newer model, man in his 40s. Let himself in after the kid left for school and Claire left for work. Stayed 11 minutes. Came out with a box and her mail. Garrett picked up the receipt, studied the plate number. Could be a landlord. Landlords don't take the mail. Could be a boyfriend. Boyfriend's knock. Garrett set the receipt down. His fingers rested on the desk, and Wade noticed what he always noticed, the slight tremor in Garrett's left hand that had started 2 years ago, and that Garrett never acknowledged and nobody ever mentioned. Early Parkinson's, maybe. Or just the accumulated vibration of 40 years on handlebars finally expressing itself in stillness. You're thinking about the bruise, Garrett said. Wade looked at him. You saw it? I didn't need to see it. I saw your face when you came in last night. I've known you for 23 years. You don't get that look over a hungry kid. You get that look when someone's being hurt. The silence between them was thick and combustible. Two men who had spent decades communicating in the shorthand of shared violence and shared grief, reading each other's damage like weather patterns. I need to know who that man is before I do anything else, Wade said carefully. If I'm wrong, you're not wrong. If I'm wrong, Garrett, and I approach Claire with accusations about someone she trusts, I lose any chance of reaching that boy. She already thinks we're dangerous. She already thinks the club killed her husband. If I show up talking about bruises and strange men with keys, she'll file a restraining order and move to another state, and we'll never see Eli again. Garrett leaned back. The chair creaked under him. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the corrugated wall, and somewhere in the garage bay a tool fell off a shelf and clattered on concrete. Neither man flinched. Run the plate, Garrett said. Dutch has a contact at the DMV office in Thermopolis. Discreet. Off the books. Get me a name by tonight. And then? And then we figure out who's walking into that house like he owns it. And if he's the one leaving marks on Mason's son... Garrett stopped. His hand closed into a fist on the desk, the tremor disappearing into the pressure of clenched fingers. Then we have a different conversation. Wade stood, paused at the door. There's something else I need to tell you, about why Mason kept them hidden. Garrett looked up. I've been thinking about it all night. Mason didn't keep his family secret because he was ashamed of the club. He kept them secret because he was afraid of something specific, someone specific. You don't hide a wife and son from your brothers unless you think your brothers aren't the only ones watching. The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Garrett's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. A recalibration, a reassessment of a dead man's choices that reframed everything they'd believed for 2 years. You think Mason was running from somebody? I think Mason was protecting them from somebody, and I think that somebody might still be around. Garrett exhaled slowly. Get me the name on that plate. Then we talk to Holt. He's the only one who was with Mason the night before the accident. If Mason said anything at all, Holt would remember. Wade nodded and left. The name came back at 6:47 that evening. Dutch called from the shop, voice low, the sound of an air compressor hissing in the background. Plates registered to a Keith Raylan, address in Cody. Works as a site foreman for a construction outfit called Bridger Basin Development. Clean record. No arrests, no warrants, nothing on file. Wade wrote the name on a fresh piece of paper. Keith Raylan. The letters felt wrong in his hand, the way a name feels wrong when you suspect it belongs to someone who hurts children, but you can't prove it yet. One more thing, Dutch added. I asked around quiet. Raylan's got a connection to the Mercer family. He was Mason's cousin. Second cousin, technically, on the mother's side. Wade closed his eyes. Family. Of course it was family. The most dangerous people in a child's life were never strangers. They were the ones who had keys and excuses and blood ties that made everyone look the other way. He brought the information to Garrett that night. The four of them, Wade, Garrett, Holt, and Dutch, sat in the garage around the workbench under the hanging shop lights, coffee going cold, cigarette smoke curling toward the corrugated ceiling. Briggs was on a long-haul ride delivering a rebuilt engine to a buyer in Montana and wouldn't be back until Thursday. Keith Raylan, Garrett said, tasting the name like something bitter. Mason's cousin. And nobody knew about him? Mason never mentioned family, Holt said. He was sitting on the edge of the workbench, his prosthetic hand resting on his knee, the mechanical fingers slightly open as if waiting to catch something. Not once. In 6 years of riding together, he never talked about parents, siblings, cousins, nothing. I asked him once, early on, before I knew better, and he changed the subject so fast I thought I'd imagined asking. Because he was hiding from this guy? Dutch asked. Or hiding Claire and Eli from him? Wade leaned forward. Here's what I know. Mason dies 2 years ago. Claire's alone with a 10-year-old, drowning in bills, no support from the county, no family that anyone knows about. And at some point, Keith Raylan shows up. Maybe he came to the funeral. Maybe he came after. But now he has a key to the house. He lets himself in when nobody's home, and the kid has bruises that didn't come from falling down. We don't know the bruises are from Raylan, Garrett said, though his voice carried no conviction. He was testing the statement, holding it up to see if it held weight. It didn't. We don't know they're not. What do we know about Claire's relationship with him? Holt asked. Is she with him? Is this a situation where she's in it voluntarily? Wade shook his head. I don't know, but I know what coercion looks like when it's wearing a family face. Man shows up after your husband dies, offers help, offers to fix things, makes himself useful, makes himself necessary. And then one day he has a key and he's going through your mail, and your kid has marks on his neck, and you can't say anything because he's the only person between you and the street. The garage was quiet except for the wind outside and the faint ticking of the space heater in the corner that never produced enough warmth to matter. I need to talk to Claire, Wade said. She told you to stay away. She told me to stay away from her son. She didn't say I couldn't show up at the hospital where she works and have a conversation between two adults about a man who lets himself into her house while she's gone. Garrett studied him. You walk into that hospital wearing leather and smelling like motor oil. She'll call security before you get to the nurse's station. Then I won't wear leather, and I'll shower first. You know what I'm really asking? Wade met his eyes. You're asking if I can do this without losing control. If I can stand in front of a woman whose husband I rode with and talk about the man who might be hurting her kid without putting my fist through a wall. Can you? Wade thought about his daughter, about the phone calls she stopped returning, about the voicemails he left that went from angry to pleading to silent over the course of a year until he stopped calling altogether because the sound of her voicemail greeting, cheerful, recorded in a life that no longer included him, was worse than any physical pain he'd ever endured. I don't know, he said, but I'm going anyway. He went the next morning. Black Hollow Regional Medical Center was a 2-story brick building that served a 3-county area with equipment that was a decade out of date and a staff that was perpetually short-handed. Wade parked the borrowed truck in the visitor lot and walked through the main entrance wearing clean jeans, a flannel shirt, and the canvas jacket. No patches, no leather. His hands were scrubbed clean of grease for the first time in weeks. He looked almost civilized, though the scar on his face and the way he moved through space, alert, balanced, scanning exits, marked him as something other than a concerned neighbor making a social call. He found Claire on the second floor, coming out of a patient room with a chart tucked under her arm, and fatigue carved so deep into her face it looked structural. She saw him before he could speak, stopped walking. Her eyes went flat and hard in the span of a heartbeat. No. 5 minutes. I said no, not here, not at my work. Claire, 5 minutes and I'm gone. Not about the club, not about Mason, about Eli. The name of her son did what nothing else could have. It cracked the wall, just slightly. Not enough to let him in, but enough to stop her from walking away. She glanced down the hallway. A doctor was reviewing notes at the nurse's station. 2 orderlies were moving a gurney near the elevator. Everyone was busy. Nobody was watching. Break room, 2 minutes. And if you raise your voice or say anything that makes me feel unsafe, I will call security and I will press charges. Fair. The break room was small and sad. A microwave, a coffee maker with a burnt carafe, a table with 3 mismatched chairs, and a window overlooking the parking lot where the gray sky pressed down on rows of employee cars like a hand pressing on a bruise. Claire sat across from Wade with her arms folded and her back to the wall, the posture of someone who had learned to keep escape routes visible. Talk. Wade chose his words with surgical precision. Every syllable mattered. One wrong phrase and she'd bolt, and the door would close permanently. I'm not here to recruit you. I'm not here to pitch the club. I'm not going to pretend I have any right to be in your life or Eli's. But I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear it as one human being talking to another, not as a biker talking to a dead friend's wife. Then ask, who has a key to your house besides you? Claire's expression didn't change, but something beneath it did. A tightening around her eyes that was almost imperceptible, a micro-movement of her jaw. The kind of physiological response that people who've been trained to hide their reactions can suppress everywhere except the muscles closest to the bone. That's none of your business. You're right, it's not. But I drove past your place yesterday morning. Not to spy, not to stalk, just to see where you lived so I'd know where Mason's family was. And I saw a silver Dodge pull into your driveway after you left for work. A man let himself in with a key. Stayed 11 minutes. Left with a box in your mail. Claire's folded arms tightened. Her knuckles went white. But she didn't speak. His name's Keith Raylan, Wade continued. Mason's cousin. I know who he is. Then you know he was in your house. He has permission. Does he have permission to go through your mail? He picks up the bills. He helps me organize. She stopped. Recalibrated. When she spoke again, her voice was colder, more controlled. Keith has been helping us since Mason died. He's family. He shows up, which is more than the club ever did. The words were a blade, and she aimed them well. Wade absorbed the cut without flinching. You're right. We failed you. We didn't know about you and Eli, but that's not an excuse. We should have looked harder. We should have asked questions. We didn't, and I'm sorry. I don't want your sorry. I know, but I need to ask you one more thing, and then I'll leave and you'll never see me at this hospital again. Claire waited. Her eyes were hard, but the hardness had fractures in it. The particular brittleness of someone holding themselves together through willpower alone, aware that the structural integrity was failing but committed to standing until the collapse became impossible to hide. The bruise on Eli's neck, Wade said. The break room temperature dropped 10 degrees. Not literally, but something in the air contracted, a withdrawal of warmth so sudden and complete that Wade could feel it against his skin like a draft from an open wound. Claire's face went blank. Not calm, blank. The particular emptiness of a person who has been confronted with something they've been hiding from themselves and now must decide in the span of seconds whether to maintain the lie or let it collapse. He fell, she said. At school, he's clumsy, Claire, he fell. Those marks weren't from a fall. I've seen enough injuries in my life to know what a hand looks like when it grabs a kid hard enough to bruise. 4 fingers, above the collarbone. That's not a fall. That's not clumsiness. That's someone putting hands on your son. Claire stood up so fast the chair scraped backward across linoleum with a sound like a scream. Her hands were shaking. Her eyes were wet, but the tears weren't falling. They were suspended, held back by sheer force of will, by the same mechanism that had allowed her to count crumpled bills in a gas station without crying, that had allowed her to work 12-hour shifts and come home to an empty house and keep standing day after day in a life that had been trying to knock her down since the moment Mason's bike went under that truck. You don't get to come here, she said, and her voice was trembling now, the controlled coldness cracking open to reveal something raw and desperate underneath. You don't get to walk into my workplace and accuse the only person who's been here for us. Keith is difficult. He's controlling. He's not the man I would have chosen. But he pays half the rent, and he keeps the lights on. And when Eli needed school supplies in September, Keith was the one who showed up. Not the county, not the school, not Mason's so-called brothers. Keith. Wade didn't stand. He kept his body low, his hands visible on the table, everything about his posture deliberate in its non-threatening geometry. I understand, he said. I understand the math. I understand what it costs to survive and who you have to accept help from when nobody else is offering. But I'm offering now. The club is offering. Whatever you need, rent, bills, groceries, car repairs, we'll cover it. No strings, no obligation. Because Mason was our brother and we owe you a debt we should have started paying 2 years ago. And in exchange? Nothing. Nothing. She repeated the word like it was a foreign language. Men don't show up with nothing. They show up with terms. Keith showed up with terms. Mason showed up with terms. Every man I've ever known showed up with terms, hidden behind smiles and promises, and she stopped, pressed her hand against her mouth. The tears finally fell. Not many. Just 2, tracking down her cheeks in parallel lines like the last structural supports of a bridge, giving way simultaneously. I can't do this here, she whispered. I have patience. I'll leave. Don't come back. I won't come here again, but Claire. He stood now slowly, keeping distance between them. If those bruises show up again, or if they show up somewhere new, you call this number. He placed a folded piece of paper on the table. day or night, and I will come. No questions, no judgment, no leather jackets. Just help. Claire stared at the paper. Didn't pick it up, didn't push it away. Wade walked out of the break room, down the hallway, past the nurse's station, through the lobby, and into the parking lot where the gray sky had darkened to the color of gunmetal, and the wind was carrying the first sharp edge of another approaching storm. He sat in the truck for 15 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, engine off, forehead pressed against the cold vinyl. His breathing was controlled. His hands were still steady. Everything else was wreckage. His phone rang. Garrett. How'd it go? She's trapped. Raylan's paying half the rent. She can't afford to lose him, and she can't afford to keep him. Classic dependency situation. The bruises? She said he fell. Then she almost fell apart. Silence on the line. Then, Holt talked to some people in Cody this morning. Raylan's construction outfit, Bridger Basin Development, lost its primary contract 6 months ago. He's working part-time now, burning through savings. If he's paying Claire's rent, he's doing it with money he's about to run out of. When the money stops, the control tightens. Always does. Wade stared through the windshield at the hospital entrance. A nurse came out, not Claire, and lit a cigarette in the cold, shivering in scrubs that weren't designed for Wyoming weather. There's one more thing, Garrett said, and his voice had the quality it took on when he was about to deliver information that changed the shape of everything. Holt remembered something about the night before Mason's accident. Wade's hand tightened on the phone. They were at the shop late, Mason and Holt, finishing a rebuild. Around midnight, Mason got a phone call, stepped outside to take it. Holt said when Mason came back in, he looked different, not scared. Mason didn't scare easy, but locked down, tight, like someone had reminded him of something he'd been trying to forget. Did Holt hear the call? Bits and pieces, through the garage door. He said Mason was arguing with someone. Quiet, but intense. And at one point Mason said, and Holt swears to this because it stuck with him, Mason said, "You come near them again and I'll end it myself. All of it. I don't care what it costs me." The words sat between them on the phone line like unexploded ordnance. Them, Wade repeated. Come near them again. Claire and Eli. And the next morning Mason rode out and never came back. The accident report said mechanical failure, front brake line. But Wade, nobody at the club ever looked at that bike after the crash. The state police handled it. We took their word. Wade's vision narrowed. The parking lot, the hospital, the gray sky, everything contracted to a single point of focus, a single question that restructured the last 2 years of grief and guilt, and unanswered silence into something far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. You're telling me Mason's brake line might not have failed on its own. I'm telling you that Mason got a threatening phone call the night before he died, and the only person he was protecting Claire and Eli from, the only person he ever needed to hide them from, was family. Keith Raylan. The name dropped through the silence like a stone into a well too deep to hear it hit bottom. We need Mason's bike, Wade said. We need to find that wreck and examine the brake line ourselves. Already on it, Holt's tracking the salvage yard that received it. If the bike still exists, we'll have it by the weekend. Wade closed his eyes. Behind them, he saw Mason Mercer grinning in the photograph on the pegboard. A man who sang terrible classic rock and fixed engines and loved his family so much he hid them from the world. A man who might not have died in an accident at all. Garrett. Yeah. If Raylan killed Mason, then we handle it. I mean it. No half measures. No waiting for a system that already failed them to fail them again. If that man killed our brother and is now hurting our brother's son, then we handle it, Wade, the way we've always handled things that the law refuses to touch. The line went dead. Wade sat in the truck as the first drops of new rain began to hit the windshield. Each drop left a small impact on the glass, spreading outward in tiny fractures that merged and ran together until the hospital disappeared behind a wall of water. He thought about Eli, about the bread, about the laugh, about 4 oval bruises pressed into the skin of a boy who had already lost everything and was about to discover that the danger hadn't ended with his father's death. It had been living in his house the entire time, sitting at his table, carrying a key, wearing the face of family. And he thought about Mason's last phone call, The words Holt remembered. "You come near them again, and I'll end it myself." Mason had known. Mason had been fighting this battle alone, without telling his brothers, without asking for help, because the threat was blood, and blood was something the club couldn't fix with wrenches and solidarity and late-night rides through the mountains. But Mason was gone now, and the threat was still standing in Claire's driveway with a key and a smile and the patience of a man who understood that control was a long game. Wade started the truck. The engine turned over rough, coughed, caught. He pulled out of the parking lot and turned north toward the clubhouse, driving through rain that felt less like weather and more like a warning. Behind him, on the second floor of Black Hollow Regional Medical Center, Claire Mercer stood at the break room window watching the truck disappear. In her hand, folded between trembling fingers, was the piece of paper with Wade's number. She hadn't thrown it away. And in the pocket of her scrubs, her phone buzzed with a text message from Keith Raylan. "Coming by tonight. Need to talk about the rent. Make sure the boy's in his room." Claire read the message 3 times. Each time, the words meant something different. The first time they sounded like logistics. The second time, they sounded like instruction. The third time, they sounded like what they actually were. A command. She put the phone back in her pocket and pressed Wade's number against her chest. Not like a lifeline, but like a loaded gun she wasn't sure she was brave enough to fire. Tonight, Keith Raylan would walk through her front door with his key and his authority and his particular way of making the walls of her home feel like they were closing in. Tonight, Eli would hear heavy boots in the hallway and crawl deeper under his covers and practice the art of becoming invisible that no 10-year-old should ever need to master. And 40 miles north, in a garage that smelled like oil and cold steel and the accumulated grief of men who had failed everyone they loved, Wade Rourke would sit beneath a photograph of a dead friend and wait for a phone call that might not come, because the woman holding the number was still more afraid of hope than she was of the man with the key. The rain kept falling on Black Hollow, Wyoming, and somewhere in the darkness between the town and the mountains, the truth about Mason Mercer's death was waiting, patient, coiled, inevitable, like a brake line cut clean and hidden beneath the frame, ready to fail at the exact moment the road turned dangerous. The call came at 11:47 p.m. Wade was sitting in the garage beneath the hanging shop lights, boots flat on the concrete floor, a cigarette burning untouched between his fingers. The photograph of Mason on the pegboard stared down at him with that frozen grin, the grin of a man who had known exactly what was coming and had ridden into it anyway, because running would have led the danger straight back to the 2 people he loved most. His phone buzzed once on the workbench, an unknown number, local area code. He answered before the second buzz. Breathing. That's all he heard at first, fast, shallow, the kind of breathing that comes from someone trying to speak and failing because the body has prioritized survival over language. Then a voice, small and fractured and far too young for the weight it was carrying. "He's hurting my mom." Wade was on his feet before the sentence ended. The cigarette hit the floor. His keys were already in his hand. "Eli, where are you?" "Bathroom. I locked the door. He's yelling at her in the kitchen, and I heard something break, and she told me to go to my room, but I can hear—" The boy's voice cracked, not with tears, with something worse, with the controlled panic of a child who had learned to manage his terror instead of expressing it, because expressing it made things louder. "I'm coming. Stay in the bathroom. Keep the door locked. Don't come out until you hear my voice. You understand?" "Yes, sir." "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Hurry, please." The line went dead. Wade didn't call Garrett, didn't call Holt or Dutch or anyone else. There wasn't time for counsel or strategy or the careful diplomacy of men who planned their approach like chess players. A child had called him from a locked bathroom while his mother was being hurt in the next room, and 20 minutes was already too long. He took the truck. The Harley would wake every sleeping street between the clubhouse and Garfield, and the last thing he needed was noise announcing his arrival to a man who might escalate if he felt cornered. The engine turned over on the first try, a small mercy in a night that was about to run out of them, and Wade pulled onto the gravel road doing 60 before he hit pavement. The highway was empty. Black Hollow at midnight was a ghost town wearing the skin of a real place, every streetlight casting pools of yellow onto sidewalks where nothing moved. Wade drove with both hands on the wheel and his jaw locked so tight his molars ached. Rain had started again. Light, needling, the kind that found every crack in your defenses and worked its way in. 14 minutes. He made it in 14. Garfield Street was dark except for the Mercer house, where light bled through the cardboard-patched window, and the front door stood 6 inches open, the way a door stands when someone has entered in a hurry and doesn't care who knows. The silver Dodge Ram sat in the driveway with its engine still ticking, which meant Raylan had arrived recently. Within the last 30 minutes, maybe less. Wade parked the truck 2 houses down, killed the engine. Sat for 3 seconds in the dark, breathing, forcing his heart rate down through the same controlled breathing technique a Marine Corps drill instructor had beaten into him 25 years ago during a deployment he never talked about. In through the nose. Hold for 4. Out through the mouth. Hold for 4. Repeat until the animal part of your brain stops screaming and the rational part takes the wheel. 3 seconds was all he allowed himself. Then he was out of the truck and moving. He didn't go through the front door. A man like Raylan, territorial, controlling, accustomed to being the largest presence in any room, would be positioned facing the entrance. Wade circled the house. Dead grass crunched under his boots. The east window with the cardboard patch was dark. Eli's bedroom, probably. He moved past it to the back of the house, where a screen door hung on one hinge and a small concrete step led to a kitchen entrance. Through the window beside the back door, he could see the kitchen. Claire was standing against the counter with her arms wrapped around herself, not in a posture of defiance, but in the particular geometry of a woman making herself as small as possible while absorbing something she'd absorbed before. A welt was forming on her left cheekbone, fresh, red, still rising. A coffee mug lay shattered on the linoleum near her feet. The fluorescent kitchen light was the sickly kind that made everything look clinical, like a scene being documented for evidence. Keith Raylan stood 4 feet in front of her, his back partially to the window. He was talking, not yelling now, but speaking in the low, measured cadence of a man who had learned that quiet control was more terrifying than volume. His hands were at his sides. His posture was relaxed. Everything about his body language said, "This is normal, this is routine, this is just how we communicate." Wade couldn't hear the words through the window. He didn't need to. He opened the back door. It didn't creak. The hinges were too loose for friction, which meant the door swung inwards silently, and Wade was standing in the kitchen doorway before either of them registered his presence. Claire saw him first. Her eyes went wide, and for a fraction of a second Wade saw something flash across her face that wasn't fear. It was relief, raw and immediate, the involuntary response of someone who had been drowning and just felt a hand close around their wrist. Raylan turned. He was bigger than Wade had expected from a distance. Not fat, solid, the way men are solid when their bodies are built for labor and maintained by habit rather than vanity. His face was broad, clean-shaven, unremarkable in the way that dangerous people are often unremarkable. He looked like a foreman. He looked like a neighbor. He looked like the kind of man who coached Little League and attended PTA meetings, and was described by everyone who knew him as a good guy, quiet, keeps to himself. He did not look like a man who left fingerprint bruises on a 10-year-old boy's neck. But he was. "Who the hell are you?" Raylan's voice was steady. Annoyed, not alarmed. The voice of a man whose authority had never been seriously challenged in this house. "I'm the one who's going to stand right here while you walk out that front door and get in your truck and drive away," Wade said. His voice was level. His hands were visible. He hadn't touched Raylan, hadn't threatened him, hadn't raised his voice or made a fist or done anything that could be described later as aggression. But the way he occupied the doorway, filling it completely, his body a wall of scar tissue and controlled stillness, communicated something that words couldn't. This is over. Not tomorrow. Not eventually. Now. Raylan didn't move. His eyes measured Wade the way a carpenter measures a board, calculating dimensions, looking for weak points, deciding whether to cut or discard. He glanced at Claire. "You called somebody." Not a question. Claire shook her head. My mom didn't call anyone." Eli's voice came from the hallway. The bathroom door had opened. The boy stood at the edge of the kitchen in pajama pants and a t-shirt, barefoot on cold linoleum, his phone clutched in one hand and his father's stubbornness locked into every muscle of his 10-year-old body. I did. Something shifted in Raylan's face. The composure cracked, not dramatically, but enough for Wade to see what was underneath. Not guilt, not shame. Rage. The particular rage of a man who controlled his environment through fear and had just discovered that the smallest, most vulnerable member of that environment had reached beyond the walls and pulled in outside help. "Eli, go to your room," Raylan said. "No." The boy didn't move. "I said go to your room." "And I said no." Eli's voice was shaking, but his feet were planted. He was terrified. Wade could see it in the tremor of his hands, in the way his shoulders were pulled up toward his ears, in the rapid pulse visible at his throat. But he was standing. Mason Mercer's son was standing in a kitchen facing down a man twice his size because his mother was bleeding and nobody else was going to stop it. Wade stepped fully into the kitchen. Not toward Raylan, toward Eli. He positioned himself between the boy and the man with the casual precision of someone who had spent a lifetime putting his body between vulnerable people and the things that wanted to hurt them. "Eli called me," Wade said, looking directly at Raylan. "He called me because he was scared. Now I'm here, and you're leaving. I don't know who you are, but this is a family matter, and you're trespassing in my—" "Your what?" Wade's voice dropped half an octave. "Your house? Your kitchen? Your family?" He let each question land separately, each one a controlled demolition charge placed at the foundation of Raylan's authority. "Because from where I'm standing, this is Claire's house. These are Claire's dishes on that floor. That's Claire's face with a mark on it. And that," he nodded toward Eli without taking his eyes off Raylan, "is Claire's son, not yours." The kitchen felt like a sealed room filling with gas. One spark and everything would ignite. Raylan's jaw worked. His hands opened and closed at his sides. Not fists, not yet, but the rehearsal of fists. The precursor movement. Wade recognized it the way a man recognizes weather patterns he's survived before. "Claire." Raylan's voice was controlled again, the rage pushed back behind the mask. "Tell this man to leave." Claire didn't speak. She stood against the counter with the welt rising on her cheek and her arms still wrapped around herself and looked at Wade Rourke, a scarred stranger in a canvas jacket who had walked into her kitchen uninvited, and made a decision that would dismantle the last 2 years of her survival architecture in a single sentence. "Keith, give me the key." Raylan turned to her slowly. "What?" "The key, to my house. Give it to me and leave." "Claire, you don't understand what you're doing. Without me, you can't—" "I know exactly what I can't do without you. I can't pay rent. I can't keep the lights on. I can't afford Eli's school supplies or the car insurance or the medical bills that are still coming 2 years after Mason died." She unfolded her arms. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was hardening, calcifying in real time, turning from something breakable into something that could cut. "But I also can't keep pretending that the price of your help isn't destroying my son. So give me the key and get out of my house." Raylan stared at her. The mask slipped further. What emerged wasn't the controlled foreman or the helpful cousin or the quietly menacing presence that filled rooms with unspoken threat. What emerged was something smaller, meaner. The distilled essence of a man who needed to be needed and couldn't survive the rejection. "You'll be on the street in 30 days, he said. "You and the boy. You'll be in a shelter, or worse. Maybe. You can't do this alone, Claire." "She's not alone." Wade hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice. But the words carried the weight of a loaded statement, backed by the kind of certainty that only comes from men who have decided something and will not be talked out of it. Raylan looked at Wade, looked at Claire, looked at Eli, still standing in the hallway with his phone in his hand and his father's stubborn jaw set in defiance. The calculus played out visibly on his face, 3 against 1, a witness with a phone, a woman who had finally found the word no and was holding it like a weapon. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a single key on a plain ring, set it on the kitchen counter with a click that sounded louder than it should have. "You'll regret this," he said to Claire. Not loudly, almost gently, the way a man says something when he wants you to understand that the threat isn't rage, It's patience. That he'll wait. That he has time. He walked past Wade without making contact, though he slowed enough to let Wade feel the mass of him, the solidity, the physical reality of a man who wasn't going away just because he'd been asked to leave a kitchen. He walked through the living room, through the front door, and out into the rain. The silver Dodge started. The headlights swept across the front of the house like searchlights. Then the truck backed out of the driveway and disappeared down Garfield Street, its taillights shrinking to red pinpoints before vanishing entirely. The house was quiet. Eli sat down on the kitchen floor. Just sat down, right there on the cold linoleum beside the broken mug, and pressed his back against the cabinet and pulled his knees to his chest and closed his eyes. The adrenaline was leaving his body, and what replaced it was a fatigue so total it looked like gravity had doubled. Claire knelt beside him. She pulled her son against her chest and held him, and for the first time in front of a stranger, she let the sound come. Not crying exactly, but the deep, shuddering exhalation of a woman releasing a breath she'd been holding for months, maybe years. Wade stood by the back door and didn't speak, didn't move closer, didn't intrude on the private geometry of a mother holding her son on a kitchen floor at midnight. He just stood there, hands at his sides, watching the doorway, listening to the rain, doing the one thing he knew how to do, keeping watch. After a long time, 3 minutes, 5, he didn't count, Claire looked up at him. Her eyes were red. The welt on her cheek had darkened to the color of a storm cloud, but her gaze was steady. "He'll come back," she said. "Not tonight, but he will." "I know." "He won't just walk away. That's not who he is. He owns things, people, situations. He'll find a way to make this hurt." "I know that too." "Then what happens next?" Wade looked at the key sitting on the counter, looked at the broken mug on the floor, looked at Eli, whose eyes were closed and whose breathing had slowed to the edge of sleep, his small body curled against his mother like a ship taking shelter in the only harbor left standing. "Next, you pack a bag for you and the boy. Enough for a few days. You're not staying here tonight." "Where would we go?" "The clubhouse. It's 40 miles north. It's heated, it's got beds, and there's always someone there." Claire almost said no. Wade could see the refusal forming, the instinctive recoil from the very thing she'd spent 2 years running from. But then she looked down at Eli, at the bruises she'd been explaining away for months, at the shattered mug and the welt on her own face, and the refusal collapsed under the weight of a truth she could no longer ignore. The thing she'd been protecting her son from wasn't the Brotherhood. It had never been the Brotherhood. 20 minutes, she said. She carried Eli to his room. Wade heard her moving through the house, drawers opening, a zipper, quiet footsteps. He stayed in the kitchen and called Garrett. 3 rings. "It's midnight, Wade. Raylan was at the house. He hit her. The boy called me. I got there. Raylan's gone, but he'll be back." No pause this time, no careful deliberation. Garrett's voice came back immediate and sharp, the command voice of a man who had led other men through situations worse than this, and knew that speed was the only thing standing between a fragile woman and a dangerous man's wounded pride. "Bring them to the clubhouse. Wake Holt. Tell him to set up the back rooms. I'll be there in an hour." "There's more." "More. The boy called me, Garrett. Not 911. Not a neighbor. Not anyone in the system that was supposed to protect them. He called me. A man he met once at a gas station in the rain. Because in 10 years of living in this town, nobody in his life, not teachers, not caseworkers, not police, not family, nobody made that kid feel safe enough to call. Until us. Silence on the line, the particular silence of a man absorbing a weight he'd carry from this moment forward. "Bring them home," Garrett said. Home. Wade noticed the word. Garrett hadn't said the clubhouse or headquarters or the shop. He'd said home, and he'd meant it. Claire emerged 15 minutes later with a duffel bag over one shoulder and Eli half asleep against her hip, wrapped in a blanket, his face buried in her neck. She locked the front door with the deadbolt, the only lock Raylan didn't have a key to, and followed Wade to the truck without looking back at the house. The drive north was 40 minutes of silence and rain. Eli slept in the back seat, curled under the blanket, his breathing slow and even. Claire sat in the passenger seat, staring through the windshield at the dark highway, her reflection ghosting in the glass. A woman watching herself leave everything behind. He killed Mason, she said. Wade's hands tightened on the wheel. He didn't look at her. He kept driving, kept his eyes on the road, kept his voice level. What do you know? Nothing I can prove. Everything I can feel. Claire's voice was flat, affectless, the tone of someone reciting facts they'd cataloged long ago and stored in a room they never entered. Mason and Keith grew up together. Keith always wanted what Mason had. The bikes, the brotherhood, the freedom. But he couldn't earn it. He was never the kind of man other men followed, so he resented it. And when Mason met me, she stopped, swallowed. Keith was interested in me first, before Mason. He asked me out twice. I said no both times. Then Mason came along and we fell in love, and Keith smiled at the wedding and toasted us and never forgave either of us for it. And after Mason died, Keith showed up 3 weeks after the funeral, helped with the bills, fixed the porch step, brought groceries, everything a good man does. But the way he did it, like he was reclaiming something that had been taken from him. Like Mason had stolen his life, and now that Mason was gone, the life was reverting back to its rightful owner. The highway unreeled through the rain, black and glistening, the truck's headlights carving a tunnel through darkness that seemed to press in from every side. 3 months in, he started controlling the money. 6 months in, he had the key. By the time the bruises started, her voice caught. By the time I realized what was happening, I was already trapped. He was paying the rent. He had copies of my bills, my bank statements, everything. And he kept saying the same thing over and over in that quiet voice. Who else is going to help you, Claire? Who else is coming? The words echoed in the cab of the truck, overlapping with Garrett's voice from days ago. Nobody else is coming. The same diagnosis from opposite ends of the moral spectrum. One man using isolation as a weapon. Another recognizing it as a wound. I don't have proof that Keith tampered with Mason's bike, Claire continued, but I know this. The night before the accident, Mason called me at 2 a.m. He was at the shop. He said Keith had shown up uninvited. They'd argued. Mason wouldn't tell me what about, but he said something he'd never said before. She turned to look at Wade, and in the dim glow of the dashboard, her eyes held the particular clarity of a woman who had stopped protecting herself from the truth. He said, "If anything happens to me, don't let Keith near Eli. Promise me, whatever you have to do." Wade drove. The rain hammered the roof. "And I broke that promise," Claire whispered, "because I was drowning, and he was the only one who showed up." "You didn't break it. You survived. There's a difference." "Is there?" Wade didn't answer, because the honest answer was complicated and the comforting answer was a lie, and Claire Mercer had endured enough lies dressed as comfort to last several lifetimes. They drove the remaining miles in silence. The clubhouse emerged from the darkness like something rising from the earth. The corrugated walls, the gravel lot, the single light above the garage bay door throwing a cone of yellow into the rain. Holt was already there, standing in the open bay with a coffee pot in his prosthetic hand, and a look on his face that said he'd heard enough from Garrett's call to understand the gravity. Wade carried Eli inside. The boy stirred once, mumbled something unintelligible, and settled against Wade's shoulder with the boneless trust of a child too exhausted to maintain fear. Holt led them to the back rooms, 2 small spaces that had been storage closets before the club converted them into basic sleeping quarters, a cot in each, a space heater, a lamp, clean blankets that smelled like detergent and motor oil. Claire took Eli and closed the door. Wade stood in the hallway outside and listened until the sound settled, blankets rustling, the cot creaking, Eli's breathing deepening into real sleep. Then he walked to the garage. Holt was waiting, and so was the thing that changed everything. Against the far wall of the garage bay, mounted on a steel frame that Holt had welded together from scrap earlier that day, sat the remains of Mason Mercer's motorcycle. The wreck had been located at a salvage yard outside Thermopolis, purchased for $300 cash, and transported back to the clubhouse in the bed of Holt's pickup. It looked like what it was, the corpse of a machine that had carried a man to his death. The frame was bent. The front forks were twisted at an angle that made Wade's stomach turn. The fuel tank was crumpled. Road rash scarred every surface like evidence written in chrome and steel, but it was the front brake line that Holt wanted him to see. Look at this. Holt held a shop light over the left fork, illuminating the rubber hydraulic line that ran from the master cylinder to the front caliper, or what remained of it. The line had ruptured approximately 4 inches from the caliper connection, the failure point cited in the state police report as the cause of the crash. Now, look closer. Holt adjusted the light. See the cut edge, the way the rubber separated? Wade leaned in. He'd rebuilt enough bikes to know what a stress failure looked like. Jagged, irregular, the result of pressure exceeding tolerance over time. This wasn't that. The edge of the rupture was clean on one side. Not perfectly clean. Someone had been careful to make it look like a tear. But the underlying cut was visible under the shop light, a straight line hidden beneath a roughened surface. Someone scored the line, Wade said. About 2/3 through, deep enough to weaken it, shallow enough to hold under normal braking. But the moment Mason hit hard braking, a downhill curve, an animal in the road, anything that required full front brake pressure, the line blows, front brake fails. At highway speed on a mountain road, that's fatal. Holt set the shop light down. His prosthetic hand was trembling, not from the mechanism, but from the man operating it. Mason didn't die in an accident, Wade. Someone cut his brake line and let the road do the rest. The garage was silent except for the rain on the roof and the slow, rhythmic ticking of the space heater. The hanging shop lights cast sharp shadows across the ruined motorcycle, turning it into something that looked less like wreckage and more like a crime scene. Wade placed both hands on the workbench and leaned forward, arms locked, head down. He stayed like that for a long time, breathing, counting, controlling the thing inside him that wanted to get in the truck and drive to Cody and find Keith Raylan's house and do something that would end with one of them in the ground. "Garrett knows?" he asked without lifting his head. "I called him as soon as I saw it. He's on his way. Claire knows, she just told me in the truck. She didn't have proof, but she knew. She's known the whole time." Holt sat down on the overturned crate, Wade's crate, the one he'd been sitting on for days, drinking bad coffee and staring at a dead man's photograph. "There's something else I need to tell you, something I should have said days ago." Wade raised his head. Holt's face was drawn, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual, the exhaustion of a man carrying information he'd been trying to outrun. He flexed his prosthetic hand once, twice, the mechanical fingers clicking against each other like the ticking of a clock measuring something that couldn't be measured. The night before Mason's crash. The phone call. "I told Garrett I heard Mason say you come near them again, and I'll end it myself." That was true, but I didn't tell him the rest. Wade waited. After the call, Mason came back into the garage. I asked him if he was okay. He said he was fine, which was obviously a lie, but Mason lied about being fine the way most people breathed, automatically and without thinking. Then he went to his toolbox and pulled out an envelope. Manila, sealed. He handed it to me and said, "Hold on to this. If something happens to me, not might, not maybe. If something happens, give this to the club. Not to Claire, to the club. She can't be connected to it." "Where's the envelope?" Holt reached under the workbench and pulled out a manila envelope, creased and worn, held shut with 2 rubber bands that had dried and cracked with age. He placed it on the bench between them. "I've been holding it for 2 years, Holt said. "I didn't open it. Mason said to give it to the club if something happened, and something happened, and I should have opened it immediately, and I didn't, because I was afraid of what was inside. Because I thought if I left it sealed, maybe Mason's death could stay an accident and I wouldn't have to face the possibility that my friend was murdered and I was holding the proof and I'd done nothing about it for 2 goddamn years." His voice broke on the last words. Not dramatically. Holt wasn't a dramatic man, but the fracture was real and deep and it shook his entire body for a single second before he regained control. Wade picked up the envelope. It was light. A few pages inside, nothing more. He pulled off the brittle rubber bands and opened the flap. Inside were 3 items. The first was a handwritten letter, single page, Mason's blocky handwriting covering both sides in dense, urgent lines. The second was a photocopy of an insurance document, Mason's life insurance policy, naming Claire Mercer as the sole beneficiary, with a payout amount of $350,000. The third was a bank statement from an account in Keith Raylan's name showing a deposit of $15,000 4 days before Mason's death. A deposit with a memo line that read, Bridger Basin Advance. Material Procurement. Wade read the letter first. It was addressed to the club. Not to any specific member. To the brotherhood as a whole, because Mason understood that what he was about to reveal required collective action, not individual response. The letter was not eloquent. It was not dramatic. It was the raw, urgent writing of a man who knew he was running out of time and wanted to leave a map for the people who might need to follow the trail he couldn't finish walking. Keith had been pressuring him for months, threatening to reveal the club's location to a rival organization in Montana that had been looking for leverage, demanding access to Claire, making comments about Eli that crossed lines Mason couldn't name in writing, but that made his skin crawl. Keith believed he was entitled to Mason's life, his wife, his family, the insurance payout that would come if Mason died. He had said it directly, the last time they spoke face to face. Everything you have should have been mine. The letter ended with a single line that Wade read 3 times, each reading driving the words deeper into a place where they would remain permanently carved into the architecture of his understanding like inscriptions on stone. If I'm dead and you're reading this, Keith did it. Protect my family. I'm sorry I couldn't. Wade set the letter down. Holt was watching him. The garage was silent. The rain had stopped at some point and neither of them had noticed. The only sound was the space heater ticking and the distant, mournful call of wind through the pine trees surrounding the clubhouse. Headlights swept across the garage wall. An engine, Garrett's Electroglide, rumbled into the gravel lot and died. Boots on gravel. The bay door opened. Garrett walked in, rain dripping from his jacket, his face set in the expression of a man who had driven 40 miles in the dark, knowing that what waited at the end would change everything and nothing about his willingness to face it. Wade handed him the letter without speaking. Garrett read it standing up beneath the shop light, beside the ruined motorcycle that carried the evidence of its own murder in the scored rubber of a brake line. He read it once, read it again. Then he folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope with the insurance document and the bank statement, and set the envelope on the workbench. Wake Dutch, he said. Wake Briggs. Everybody. Tonight. What are we doing? Garrett looked at the motorcycle, at the cut brake line, at the photograph of Mason on the pegboard, grinning, immortal, already dead when the picture was taken, but none of them knew it yet. We're going to do the thing the system was supposed to do and didn't. We're going to protect that woman and her son. We're going to take the evidence, the bike, the letter, the bank records, and we're going to hand it to the state police in Cheyenne, not the county office that failed Claire twice, not the local department that closed the case as an accident, but state level. And we're going to stand behind her while the law does what it should have done 2 years ago. He paused. His hand was trembling again. The left one, the one he never acknowledged. But this time he looked at it, studied it, accepted it. And if the law fails again, he said quietly, then we become something else, something Mason needed us to be, and we weren't, something that Keith Raylan hasn't accounted for in whatever calculation he's running in his head right now. What's that? Holt asked. Garrett looked at him, at Wade, at the ruined bike and the hanging lights, and the garage that smelled like oil and cold steel, and the particular weight of men who had just discovered that their brother was murdered and that their grief had been weaponized against them by a man who believed he was untouchable. Consequences, Garrett said. The word settled into the garage like something with physical mass. It pressed against the corrugated walls. It filled the spaces between the tools on the pegboard and the oil stains on the concrete and the photograph of Mason Mercer that had been watching over them for 2 years, waiting, patient, silent, trusting, for the men he'd ridden beside to finally read the letter he'd left behind and understand that his death was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. And in the back room of the clubhouse, behind a closed door, Eli Mercer slept against his mother's chest in a narrow cot that smelled like detergent and motor oil, dreaming of a gas station in the rain and a man with a scarred face who had laughed while saying his father's name, unaware that 40 feet away, in a garage lit by hanging shop lights, The men his mother had spent 2 years running from were now the only wall standing between his family and the man who had taken his father and intended to take everything else. The engines outside were cold and silent, but they wouldn't be for long. They came for Eli at dawn, not with sirens, not with warrants or uniforms or any of the mechanisms a functioning society deploys when a child is in danger. They came with paperwork, a single sheet of cream-colored legal stationery delivered by a man in a gray suit who knocked on the clubhouse door at 6:15 a.m., while the sky was still the color of ash and the gravel lot was frozen solid beneath a skin of black ice. Wade answered the door. The man in the suit didn't introduce himself. He handed Wade the paper, turned, walked back to a white sedan parked at the edge of the lot, and drove away before Wade had finished reading the first paragraph. It was an emergency custody petition filed in Fremont County Family Court. Petitioner, Keith Raylan. Relationship to child, second cousin and primary financial supporter. The petition alleged that Claire Mercer was an unfit mother, citing unstable housing, insufficient income, emotional distress, and association with known members of an outlaw motorcycle organization that posed a direct threat to the child's safety and well-being. The filing requested immediate temporary custody of Eli Mercer pending a full hearing, and it was scheduled for 9 a.m. the following morning. 18 hours. Raylan had given them 18 hours. Wade read the petition twice in the cold morning air, his breath fogging around the words, and then walked into the garage where Garrett was sitting with a cup of coffee and the manila envelope spread open on the workbench. Mason's letter, the insurance document, the bank statement. Studying the evidence like a general studying a map of terrain, he was about to cross under fire. "He's not coming for us," Wade said, setting the petition on the bench beside the envelope. "He's coming for the boy. Through the courts." Garrett picked up the petition. "Read it." His face didn't change, but his hand, the trembling left one, closed around his coffee mug with enough pressure to turn his knuckles white. "Association with known members of an outlaw motorcycle organization," Garrett read aloud. "He's using us. The fact that Claire brought Eli here last night, he's turning it into evidence of her unfitness. He knew she'd come to us. He let her leave the house because he knew where she'd go and he knew exactly how to weaponize it." Garrett set the mug down, looked at the petition, looked at the manila envelope. Two documents side by side on a steel workbench in a garage that smelled like chain lube and old coffee. One containing proof that Keith Raylan had murdered Mason Mercer, the other containing proof that the system Raylan was manipulating had already failed the Mercer family twice and was about to fail them a third time unless someone intervened with something stronger than evidence and better than hope. "Wake everyone," Garrett said. Within an hour, they were all there. Holt sat on the workbench, flexing his prosthetic hand, the mechanical fingers clicking in rhythmic intervals that matched his heartbeat. Dutch leaned against the wall beside the rolling door, arms crossed, grease still under his fingernails from a rebuild he'd abandoned mid-torque when the call came. Briggs, back from Montana since 3 a.m., road-tired, smelling of diesel and frozen wind, stood in the corner like a monument, his massive arms at his sides and his eyes carrying the flat, patient expression of a man who had decided what needed to happen and was simply waiting for permission. Claire sat in a folding chair near the office door. She'd read the petition. She hadn't cried. The tears had been used up somewhere between midnight and dawn, replaced by something colder and more functional, a survival clarity that stripped away everything except the immediate question, how do I keep my son? Eli was still sleeping in the back room. Nobody woke him. What was about to be discussed didn't belong in a 10-year-old's ears. "Here's where we are," Garrett said, standing in the center of the garage with the petition in one hand and Mason's letter in the other, holding them up like a man weighing two futures on a scale. "We have evidence that Keith Raylan murdered Mason Mercer, a scored break line, a letter from Mason naming Raylan, bank records showing suspicious deposits. But we also have a custody petition that hits court in 18 hours, and the moment Raylan gets temporary custody of Eli, that boy disappears into a system that's already proven it doesn't give a damn about the Mercer family." "We go to the state police," Dutch said. "Now, this morning. Hand them the bike, the letter, everything. They open a murder investigation. Raylan gets arrested. The custody petition dies on the vine." timing, Holt said, shaking his head. Even if the state police take us seriously, and a group of bikers walking into a station with a 2-year-old wreck and a handwritten letter isn't exactly a slam-dunk credibility play, an investigation takes weeks, months. The custody hearing is tomorrow morning. Raylan walks into that courtroom with his clean record and his construction job and his suit and tie, and Claire walks in as a broke nurse who spent last night in a biker clubhouse. Who does the judge believe? The silence that followed was the worst kind. The silence of people who know the answer to a question they wish they hadn't asked. "What about a lawyer?" Claire asked. Her voice was steady but thin, stretched to the breaking point of what steadiness could hold. "Can we get a lawyer before tomorrow?" "Family law attorney in Fremont County," Dutch said. "I made some calls. The only two who handle custody cases are both on retainer with Bridger Basin Development for worksite liability issues, Raylan's company, which means conflict of interest. Neither one can represent me. The next closest is in Casper, 2.5 hours. I left a message, but nobody's picked up." Claire closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were dry and hard and aimed at Garrett with the precision of a woman who had stopped hoping and started calculating. "What are you actually proposing?" she asked. "Because I know what this looks like. I know the math. I've been doing impossible math for 2 years, so skip the speeches and tell me what you're going to do." Garrett looked at her, at the welt on her cheek that had darkened overnight to a bruise the color of thunderclouds, at her hands folded in her lap, still and controlled, the hands of a nurse who kept people alive for $14 an hour and couldn't keep herself safe in her own kitchen. "2 tracks, Garrett said, simultaneously. Track 1. Dutch drives to Casper, finds a family attorney, gets them to the courthouse in Lander by 9 a.m. tomorrow, even if he has to drag them there personally. We bring the evidence, all of it, and we file a counterpetition alleging abuse and present Mason's letter and the brake line evidence as grounds for an immediate restraining order against Raylan. In track 2? Garrett paused, looked at Wade. Wade looked back with an expression that communicated everything and committed to nothing. The expression of a man standing at the edge of a line he'd crossed before and knew the cost of crossing again. Track 2, Garrett said carefully, is insurance, in case track 1 doesn't work. What kind of insurance? The kind that makes sure Keith Raylan is not in a position to walk into that courthouse tomorrow. The garage held its breath. Claire stared at Garrett. She understood what he was saying. She understood it with the same clarity that allowed her to calculate dosages and monitor vital signs and make life-or-death decisions under fluorescent lights, while doctors argued and machines beeped and patients coded on tables in front of her. She understood that these men, scarred, damaged, held together by engine grease and unspoken grief, were offering to do the thing that the law couldn't or wouldn't do, and that accepting their offer would make her complicit in something she could never undo. "Don't tell me the details," she said. "Whatever you do, don't tell me. We won't. And don't hurt him in front of my son. We won't do that either." She stood, walked to the back room without another word. The door closed. Through the thin wall, they heard her sit on the cot beside Eli, and then silence. The silence of a mother guarding the sleep of a child whose world was about to change in ways neither of them could predict. Garrett waited until the door had been closed for a full minute. Then he turned to the men in the garage and his voice dropped to a register that none of them had heard in years. The register he reserved for situations that lived outside the boundaries of normal decision-making. "Nobody's getting hurt," he said. "I need that understood. We're not criminals, and we're not going to become criminals to fix this. But Keith Raylan needs to understand that the calculation has changed, that he's not dealing with a broke nurse and a scared kid anymore. He's dealing with us, and he needs to understand that before he walks into that courthouse." "How?" Holt asked. "We pay him a visit. Tonight. All of us. We bring Mason's letter, we bring photographs of the brake line, and we give him a choice. Withdraw the custody petition and leave the state voluntarily, or we hand everything to the state police and the Fremont County DA and every news outlet in Wyoming simultaneously, and let the system that he's been gaming for 2 years eat him alive." "And if he doesn't take the deal?" Wade asked. "Then we go to the state police anyway, and we pray that the legal timeline moves faster than the custody timeline. But I'm betting he takes the deal, because Keith Raylan isn't a brave man. He's a parasite. He attacked a woman and a child because they were alone and vulnerable. He murdered his cousin because Mason was the only person standing between him and the life he wanted. He's not prepared for 5 men showing up at his door with evidence of murder and the willingness to use it. He might run, Dutch said. If he runs, the petition dies. Claire keeps Eli. We file the evidence with state police and let them chase him. Running solves the immediate problem. He might fight, Briggs said. The first words he'd spoken all morning. His voice was low, unhurried, shaped by decades of measured silence into something that carried weight far beyond its volume. Garrett looked at him. If he fights, we don't fight back. We absorb it. We document it. And we add assault to the evidence package. 5 witnesses, every one of us with a phone recording. He throws a punch at a group of men who came to his door with a letter from a dead man. That's not self-defense. That's a confession. The plan was imperfect. They all knew it. It relied on the assumption that Raylan was rational, that his self-preservation instinct was stronger than his need for control, that confronted with evidence of his own crime, he would choose flight over fight. And men like Raylan, men who had killed once and gotten away with it, men who had spent 2 years building a cage around a woman and child while the world looked the other way, those men didn't always behave rationally when the cage was threatened. But it was the only plan they had. And the clock on the wall read 8:47 a.m., which meant they had 24 hours and 13 minutes before a judge in Lander would decide whether Eli Mercer belonged with his mother or with the man who had murdered his father. Dutch left for Casper at 9. His truck disappeared down the gravel road in a plume of frozen dust, heading south toward a lawyer who might not exist and a legal strategy built on evidence that was 2 years old and circumstantial at best. The rest of them spent the day preparing, not with weapons. Garrett had been explicit about that, and nobody argued. They prepared with information. Holt compiled a file. Photographs of the scored brake line taken under the shop light. Mason's letter photographed page by page, the bank statement, the insurance document, Claire's medical records from 2 visits to the Black Hollow Clinic, where she'd been treated for injuries she attributed to a fall in a door frame, and the inexhaustible creativity of a woman inventing explanations for violence. Dutch had pulled those records through a contact at the clinic, not legally, not properly, but with the quiet cooperation of a nurse who had suspected for months that Claire's injuries weren't accidental and had been waiting for someone to ask. By afternoon, the file was thick enough to ruin a man's life, which was exactly the point. Wade spent the afternoon in the garage with Mason's wrecked Harley. He didn't work on it. There was nothing to work on, nothing to fix. He just sat beside it on the overturned crate and looked at the machine that had carried his friend to death, the machine that bore the evidence of murder in the clean-cut edge of a brake line, and he tried to reconcile 2 years of grief with the new understanding that the grief had been manufactured. That Mason hadn't died because of freedom or risk or the inherent danger of riding. Mason had died because a jealous man with a sharp blade and 11 inches of access to a hydraulic line had decided that the fastest way to get what he wanted was to remove the obstacle. Eli found him there at 4 o'clock. The boy appeared in the garage doorway, wrapped in one of the club's old blankets, barefoot despite the cold concrete, hair matted from sleep, looking every bit the exhausted, displaced, bewildered child that he was. "That's my dad's bike," Eli said. Wade looked at him, looked at the wreck. "Yeah, it is. Why is it here?" Wade chose his words the way a surgeon chooses incisions, carefully, precisely, aware that cutting too deep would cause damage that couldn't be repaired. "We brought it here to understand what happened to your dad." "I know what happened. He crashed." "That's what everyone thought." Eli stepped into the garage. His bare feet made no sound on the concrete. He stood beside the wrecked bike and reached out with one hand, touching the dented fuel tank with fingers so light they might have been touching something alive, something sacred. "Was it not a crash?" His voice was quiet. Not afraid, resigned. The tone of a child who had already learned that the truth was usually worse than the story and had stopped being surprised by it. "It was a crash," Wade said, "but somebody made sure it happened." Eli's hand stayed on the tank. His thumb traced the edge of a dent. a small, meaningless dent in a fuel tank covered with damage, but his thumb found it and followed it as if reading a message in Braille. "Keith," the boy said. Wade looked at him sharply. "What makes you say that?" "Because my dad was afraid of him. He never said it. But I could tell. The way he checked the locks at night when Keith had visited, the way he'd stand at the window after Keith left, watching the road, making sure the truck was really gone." Eli pulled his hand away from the tank. "I was 8. People think 8-year-olds don't notice things. We notice everything. We just don't have words for what we're seeing." The boy looked at Wade with Mason's eyes, dark, steady, carrying too much knowledge for the age of the face that held them. "Are you going to stop him?" "Yes." "How?" "Tonight. We're going to talk to him, show him what we know, give him a chance to walk away." "He won't walk away." "He might." "He won't." Eli said it with the flat certainty of someone who understood Keith Raylan not through evidence or investigation, but through the lived experience of 2 years spent in the same house as a predator. He doesn't give up things. He takes them, and when he can't take them, he breaks them. That's what he does. Wade looked at this boy. 10 years old, barefoot on cold concrete, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like motor oil, standing beside the wreckage of his murdered father's motorcycle, and felt something shift inside him that had been locked in place for years. A door opening, a wall collapsing, the particular structural failure that occurs when a man who has sworn off attachment encounters someone he cannot walk away from. "Then we'll be ready for that too," Wade said. Eli nodded. Not with trust exactly. Trust was something he distributed carefully and in small amounts, the currency of a child who had been betrayed by the adults responsible for keeping him safe. But with something adjacent to trust, something that looked like the beginning of belief. "Can I stay out here with the bike?" "Yeah, you can stay." Eli sat down on the concrete beside the wrecked Harley, pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders, and leaned his back against the bent frame of his dead father's motorcycle. Within minutes, his eyes were closed. Not sleeping. Listening. Listening to the garage sounds, the space heater ticking, the wind outside, the distant murmur of voices as the men who had ridden with his father prepared to confront the man who had killed him. Wade watched the boy and thought about his own daughter, about the phone calls, about the silence that had replaced them, about the specific quality of failure that came from being a man who would ride through a blizzard for a stranger but couldn't figure out how to stay in the same room as his own child. Not this time. Not with this kid. He covered Eli with a second blanket from the supply closet and went to find Garrett. Dutch called at 5:30. He'd found a lawyer. Catherine Voss, family law, 17 years experience, offices in Casper. She'd reviewed the evidence package Dutch had faxed from a copy shop on the highway and agreed to represent Claire at the hearing. She'd be at the courthouse in Lander by 8:30 a.m., but she'd said something else, something Dutch relayed in a voice tight with controlled urgency. She said the evidence of the brake line tampering in Mason's letter changed the game completely. But she also said that if we confront Raylan tonight and he reports it as intimidation, the judge could use that against Claire tomorrow. It could look coordinated. It could look like the club is running an operation, and Claire's part of it. Garrett absorbed this. He stood in the office with the phone on speaker, Wade beside him, Holt leaning against the doorframe. "She's saying don't go," Holt translated. "She's saying be smart about how we go," Garrett corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Garrett looked at the clock. 5:37 p.m., 15 hours and 23 minutes until the hearing. Keith Raylan was in Cody, 45 minutes east, probably sitting in his living room, probably drinking, probably rehearsing the performance he'd deliver in front of a judge tomorrow. Concerned relative, stable provider, reluctant petitioner forced to act by the reckless behavior of a troubled mother who fled to a biker compound with an impressionable child. The performance would work. That was the unbearable truth. In a courtroom, appearance was evidence, and Keith Raylan had spent a lifetime perfecting the appearance of a decent man. "We go," Garrett said. "But we adjust. No group, no show of force, just me and Wade. 2 men, not 5. We don't threaten. We don't posture. We present the evidence and we tell him what's coming. If he withdraws the petition, this stays between us. If he doesn't, the state police get everything tomorrow. And if he reacts badly, then we leave, immediately, and we let the evidence do the work in court. That's a hell of a gamble, Garrett. The whole thing's a gamble. The whole thing's been a gamble since Wade met a kid at a gas station in the rain. We're gambling that the truth matters more than the system. And if it doesn't, he stopped. Looked at the photograph of Mason on the pegboard. The grin. The invincibility. The lie of immortality that every young man tells himself until the world proves him wrong. If it doesn't, then we figure out what comes next when next comes. They left at 7 p.m. Garrett drove his truck. Wade rode beside him in the passenger seat with the evidence file in a manila folder on his lap and a feeling in his chest like something was being compressed. Not fear, not anger, but the pressurized weight of responsibility. The understanding that what happened in the next 2 hours would determine whether a 10-year-old boy slept tomorrow night with his mother or in the spare room of the man who had killed his father. The drive to Cody took 43 minutes. Neither of them spoke for the first 30. The highway unwound through darkness and frozen landscape, the headlights of Garrett's truck cutting a narrow path through terrain that felt hostile, not dangerous in the immediate sense, but hostile in the geological sense, the landscape of a place that didn't care about human urgency and would outlast every crisis played out on its surface. "You never told me about your daughter," Garrett said at minute 31. Not a question, an observation, an opening, offered without pressure. Wade watched the road. "Nothing to tell." "There's always something to tell. You just decided it wasn't worth telling." "She decided I wasn't worth calling. That's a pretty complete story." "Is it?" Wade didn't answer for a mile. 2 miles. The truck hummed. The heater pushed warm air that smelled like oil and vinyl. "Her name's Megan," Wade said. "She's 26, lives in Portland, works for a nonprofit that does, I don't even know, environmental something. She's smart. Smarter than me, which isn't saying much, but smarter than most people, which is..." He paused. "She stopped talking to me after her mother died. Jenny, my ex. Jenny got sick. Cancer. I was supposed to be there. I was supposed to show up and sit in the waiting room and drive her to appointments and do the things that husbands do even when they're not husbands anymore. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't sit in those rooms. I couldn't watch her disappear. So I rode. I put miles between me and the hospital, and I told myself I'd go tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow, until there weren't any tomorrows left, and Megan called me from the hospital at 4 in the morning and told me her mother was gone and that I should be too. The truck's headlights caught a reflective sign, Cody, 12 miles. That was 3 years ago, Wade continued. I've called her maybe 60 times since then. She's never picked up. I've left messages that started angry and ended pathetic, and eventually I stopped leaving them because the sound of my own voice asking my daughter to forgive me was worse than silence. Garrett drove. He didn't offer comfort or platitudes or the kind of easy redemption narrative that men tell each other in dark trucks on cold highways. He just listened, which was enough. "That's why the boy matters," Wade said. "Not because of Mason, not because of the club, because I failed my own kid and I can't unfail her, and the only thing left is to not fail this one." "I know," Garrett said. "I've always known." They reached Cody at 7:48. Keith Raylan's address, pulled from the DMV records Dutch's contact had provided, led them to a subdivision on the east side of town. Newer construction, cookie-cutter houses, the kind of development that sprouts on the edge of dying western towns like artificial life support. Raylan's house was the third from the corner, identifiable by the silver Dodge Ram in the driveway and the single light burning in the front room. Garrett parked across the street, killed the engine. They sat in the dark for 2 minutes, watching the house, reading the silhouette that moved behind the front window. A man pacing, phone to his ear, free hand gesturing with the agitated energy of someone conducting business that couldn't wait. "Ready?" Garrett asked. "No." "Good. Being ready for something like this means you've done it too many times." They crossed the street, walked up the concrete path. Garrett rang the doorbell. The sound was absurdly domestic, a cheerful two-tone chime that belonged in a sitcom, not in the opening movement of a confrontation between a murderer and the brothers of the man he'd killed. The pacing silhouette stopped. Footsteps approached the door. It opened. Keith Rayland stood in the doorway wearing jeans and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, a phone still in one hand, a bottle of beer in the other. His face registered Wade first. Recognition, recalibration, the rapid assessment of a man encountering a known threat in an unexpected location. Then he saw Garrett. His eyes went to Garrett's hands, to Wade's hands, to the manila folder. "Evening, Keith," Garrett said. His voice was conversational, almost friendly, the voice of a man who had learned that the quietest delivery carried the most force. "I don't know who you are." "Garrett Dunn, Iron Hollow MC. I was Mason Mercer's president for 6 years, and this," he nodded toward Wade, "you already know." Rayland's grip tightened on the beer bottle. Not fear, calculation. The rapid mathematics of a man assessing whether the situation was manageable. "It's late, and I don't have business with you." "Actually, you do." Garrett held up the manila folder. "Can we come inside? This conversation works better sitting down." "No, whatever you're selling, I'm not buying. And if this is about Claire, this is about Mason." The name hit differently than it had at the gas station when Eli said it. At the gas station, it had been a ghost appearing in the rain. Here, on Rayland's own doorstep, it was an accusation. Rayland stared at the folder, at Garrett, at Wade. The calculation continued behind his eyes, fast, cold, the machinery of a mind that had been operating in survival mode for 2 years and was now detecting the first tremor of structural failure. "5 minutes," Rayland said, and stepped aside. They entered. The living room was clean to the point of sterility. Furniture arranged with geometric precision, no photographs on the walls, no personal items visible. The room of a man who lived alone and preferred it that way, or the room of a man who had removed anything that could connect him to a life he was trying to erase. Garrett didn't sit. Wade didn't sit. They stood in the living room while Rayland closed the front door and positioned himself near the hallway. Close to an exit, Wade noted. The instinct of a man who had lived with the possibility of discovery and planned his escapes in advance. Garrett opened the folder, removed the photographs of the scored brake line, placed them on the coffee table. Rayland looked at them. His face didn't change, but his breathing did. A slight acceleration, barely visible, the kind of involuntary response that the body produces when the brain recognizes danger before the conscious mind admits it. "Mason's front brake line," Garrett said, "recovered from the salvage yard 3 days ago. Scored with a blade approximately 2/3 through the wall. Positioned to fail under hard braking at highway speed." Rayland picked up the beer bottle from where he'd set it on an end table, took a long, deliberate drink, put it down. So Mason's death wasn't an accident. Someone cut that line, and we know who." Garrett removed the letter, placed it beside the photographs. Mason's handwriting, blocky, urgent, the script of a man running out of time, faced upward under the living room light. "Mason wrote this before he died. He named you. He described the threats. He documented your obsession with his family, and he left it with a member of our club with instructions to deliver it if anything happened to him." Rayland looked at the letter. He didn't pick it up. He read it from where he stood, leaning slightly forward, his eyes tracking the lines of handwriting with an expression that Wade couldn't identify at first, and then recognized with a chill that traveled the full length of his spine. Recognition. Not surprise. Not shock. Not the face of an innocent man confronted with a false accusation. Recognition. The expression of a man seeing something he knew existed but believed had been destroyed. "He told me he burned it," Rayland said quietly, and then, realizing what he'd just admitted, his face went blank. The room changed temperature. "He told you he burned it," Garrett repeated, each word placed with the precision of a nail driven into a coffin. "Which means you knew about the letter. Which means Mason confronted you with it. Which means the night before he died, when he called you and told you to stay away from his family, that conversation wasn't a warning, it was a last stand. And you responded by cutting his brake line and letting the mountain do the rest." Rayland's composure fractured. Not completely. The mask held in the way that masks do when they've been worn so long they've fused with the skin beneath, but the cracks were visible now, in the tightness around his mouth, in the way his weight shifted to the balls of his feet. In the particular tension of his hands that had moved from his sides to the edge of the hallway table, where his fingers rested near a ceramic bowl that held keys and loose change, and nothing that qualified as a weapon but could become one. "You can't prove anything," Raylan said. "A scratched brake line on a 2-year-old wreck. A letter that could have been written by anyone. You think the police are going to take the word of a biker gang over? We're not a gang. We're the men who rode with the man you murdered, and the police won't need to take our word for anything. The brake line is physical evidence. The letter is documentary evidence. Your bank records show a $15,000 deposit 4 days before Mason's death from a company that was already losing contracts. And your recent behavior, the custody petition, the control over Claire, the bruises on a 10-year-old boy, establishes a pattern that any prosecutor with a pulse could present to a grand jury." Garrett stepped forward. One step, small, controlled, but it crossed a boundary in the room that both men recognized, the boundary between conversation and confrontation. "Here's what happens next, Keith. You withdraw the custody petition, tonight. You call your attorney and you withdraw it before the courthouse opens tomorrow morning. Then you leave Wyoming. Not next week, not next month. Now, tonight. You get in that truck and you drive until this state is behind you and you don't come back. And if I don't? Then at 8 a.m. tomorrow, every piece of evidence in this folder goes to the Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation, the Fremont County DA, and the Associated Press field office in Casper, simultaneously. And by noon, the name Keith Raylan will be attached to a murder investigation that will follow you for the rest of your life." The silence that filled the room was absolute. Wade could hear his own heartbeat, could hear Garrett's breathing, could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the wind outside pressing against the windows with the patient insistence of weather that would outlast everything happening inside this house. Raylan looked at the letter on the coffee table, at the photographs, at 2 men who had ridden through darkness and cold to stand in his living room and offer him the thing that men like him never expected to receive, consequences. And then he did the thing that neither of them had predicted. He laughed. Not loudly, not dramatically, a quiet, exhaled sound that was more resignation than amusement. The laugh of a man who has been running a long con and just realized the game is over and finds the ending almost funny in its inevitability. "Mason always was smarter than me," Raylan said. Even dead, he outplayed me." He picked up his phone from the end table, dialed a number, waited. When the line connected, he spoke 3 sentences. "It's Keith Raylan. Withdraw the custody petition. All of it." He hung up, set the phone down, looked at Garrett with an expression that had emptied of everything: rage, calculation, composure, fear, leaving behind the hollowed face of a man who had just watched his own architecture collapse. "I'll be gone by morning," Raylan said. "But I want you to know something. Mason didn't understand what he had. Claire, the boy, the house, the life. He didn't appreciate any of it. He was out riding with you people while his wife worked doubles and his kid ate cereal for dinner. I was there. I showed up. I was the one who—" "You were the one who killed him," Wade said. "You killed him, and then you walked into his home, and you took his wife's autonomy, and you put your hands on his son. You didn't show up for them, Keith. You showed up for yourself every single time." Raylan's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing came out. "Gone by morning," Garrett repeated. "And if you ever contact Claire or Eli again, by phone, by mail, by proxy, by any mechanism available to you, there will be no second conversation. There will be no folder on a coffee table. There will just be consequences, and they won't come with a warning." They left. They walked out of Keith Raylan's house into the frozen Cody night, crossing the street to the truck in silence. Garrett started the engine. Wade sat in the passenger seat with the empty folder on his lap and his hands on his knees and his eyes fixed on the windshield where the first crystals of ice were forming in patterns that looked random, but weren't. They were 2 miles outside of Cody when Wade's phone rang. Holt, breathless, the sound of running, the sound of panic barely contained. "Get back here. Now. Raylan's guy, someone. They came while you were gone. Truck pulled up to the clubhouse 10 minutes ago. 3 men. They didn't come inside, but they left something on the doorstep." "What?" "A gas can. Full. With a note taped to it. The note says, The boy comes home, or the clubhouse burns. You have until sunrise. Wade looked at Garrett. Garrett's foot hit the accelerator. The truck surged forward into the darkness, the engine roaring, the speedometer climbing past 70, 80, the frozen highway blurring beneath them. Raylan had called someone before he called his lawyer. He had made arrangements, insurance, the kind of insurance that men like him always carried. Not policies or paperwork, but people. People who owed him. People who would deliver threats and gasoline to a building where a woman and her son were sleeping. The withdrawal of the petition was real. The surrender was theater. And back at the clubhouse, in a garage that smelled like oil and old coffee and the accumulated weight of brotherhood, Eli Mercer slept beside his father's wrecked motorcycle while three men stood watch over a gas can left by strangers on a doorstep that had never been a fortress but was about to become one. The night was just beginning, and the war Garrett had tried to prevent was already at the door. Garrett's truck hit the clubhouse gravel at 9:23 p.m., the headlights sweeping across a scene that looked like a war council frozen in mid-breath. Holt stood at the open bay door with a shotgun cradled against his chest, not aimed, not raised, just held with the casual readiness of a man who had carried weapons through worse situations and understood that visible firepower was its own language. Briggs was beside him, arms crossed, his massive frame blocking half the doorway. Inside, through the gap between them, Wade could see Claire standing in the hallway that led to the back rooms, her body positioned between the garage and the door behind which Eli slept. The gas can sat on the concrete step beside the bay entrance. Red plastic, 5-gallon, full. The note was taped to the handle with blue painter's tape, handwritten in block letters on a torn piece of cardboard, the penmanship of someone who wasn't trying to be identified. Wade picked it up, read it again even though Holt had already told him what it said. The boy comes home or the clubhouse burns. You have until sunrise. Cameras? Garrett asked, stepping out of the truck. We don't have cameras, Holt said. Never needed them. Description of the truck? Dark-colored pickup, newer. 3 men inside, maybe 4. They pulled up, one guy got out, set the can down, got back in. Whole thing took 30 seconds. By the time I got to the door, they were already at the end of the road. Garrett took the gas can and the note inside. He set both on the workbench beside the manila envelope that still held Mason's letter, creating a display that told the entire story in objects. A dead man's testimony beside a murderer's threat, the past and present of the Mercer family's suffering laid out on cold steel under hanging shop lights. He's bluffing, Dutch said. Dutch had returned from Casper 20 minutes earlier, the lawyer's retainer agreement signed, and a court appearance confirmed for 9 a.m. The legal track was in motion. But the legal track existed in a world of schedules and procedures and reasonable timelines, and Keith Raylan had just introduced a variable from a different world entirely. Maybe, Garrett said, but we don't bet a woman and a child's safety on maybe. So what do? Sit here all night waiting for somebody to throw a match? No, we call the police. The words landed in the garage like something dropped from a height. Every man in the room looked at Garrett, calling the police, inviting the system into the clubhouse, opening the doors to badges and questions and the inevitable scrutiny that came with law enforcement attention went against every instinct the Iron Hollow MC had operated on for decades. They handled their problems internally. They kept the world at arm's length. The clubhouse existed precisely because it was a place beyond the reach of institutions that had failed every man in the room at one point or another. But Garrett wasn't protecting the club tonight. He was protecting a 10-year-old boy. We call the sheriff's department. We report the threat. We hand them the gas can and the note. And while they're here, we hand them copies of everything. The brake line photographs, Mason's letter, the bank records, Claire's medical documentation. All of it. Tonight. Not tomorrow. Not at the courthouse. Now. Garrett, I know what I'm doing. His voice was steady, but his left hand tremored against his thigh. And he didn't hide it this time. I know what it costs. I know they'll look at this building and see exactly what Keith Raylan wants them to see. A bunch of bikers with a scared woman and a kid in a room that smells like engine oil. I know the optics are terrible, but the alternative is sitting here until sunrise playing defense against a threat we can't see, with a child sleeping 40 feet away, gambling that a man who has already committed murder won't follow through on an arson threat. And I'm not making that gamble. Not with Eli in the building. Nobody argued. The math was ugly, but it was honest, and every man in the room had spent enough years lying to themselves about enough things to recognize honesty when it stood in front of them wearing a trembling hand and 20 years of accumulated authority. Wade made the call. The Fremont County Sheriff's Department dispatched 2 deputies who arrived in 14 minutes, faster than anyone expected, which suggested either a slow night or a dispatcher who took arson threats against buildings containing children seriously. They were young, professional, and visibly uncomfortable in the clubhouse. One of them, a woman named Torres with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense posture, examined the gas can and the note while her partner took statements from Holt and Briggs. Garrett presented the evidence, all of it. He laid the photographs and documents on the workbench the way a man lays cards on a table when he's decided to stop bluffing, and he told the story from the beginning: Mason's death, the scored brake line, the letter, Keith Rayland's custody petition, the abuse, Claire's statement, the confrontation in Cody, and the threat that had followed them home. Deputy Torres listened without interruption. She studied the brake line photographs with the particular focus of someone who understood mechanical systems. Her father had been a mechanic, she mentioned later, almost offhandedly, the way people reveal the details that explain their competence. She read Mason's letter twice. She looked at the wrecked motorcycle mounted on its steel frame against the garage wall. "This needs to go to DCY," she said. Division of Criminal Investigation, state level, the words Garrett had been aiming for. The brake line evidence alone warrants a forensic examination. Combined with the letter and the financial records, she looked at Garrett. "You understand that once I submit this, it's out of your hands. You don't get to control the timeline or the outcome." "I understand. And you understand that this building, this organization, will receive scrutiny as part of any investigation. The county won't ignore the fact that a victim and her child are staying at a motorcycle club's headquarters." "I understand that too." Torres nodded. She bagged the gas can and the note as evidence. She took copies of every document in the manila folder. She photographed the wrecked motorcycle and the scored brake line from 6 different angles with a department-issue camera. And before she left, she did something that surprised everyone. She walked to the back hallway, knocked gently on the closed door, and when Claire opened it, Torres spoke to her quietly for 3 minutes. Wade couldn't hear what was said. But when Torres left and Claire returned to the garage, something in Claire's face had shifted. A loosening of the muscles around her eyes, the particular relaxation that comes from being believed by someone with the authority to act on that belief. "She's filing a protection order tonight," Claire said, "against Keith, emergency basis, effective immediately. Will it hold?" She said she'd have it in front of a judge within the hour. She also said— Claire paused, looked at the men in the garage, at the workbench covered in evidence, at the wrecked motorcycle bearing the proof of her husband's murder. She said that in 17 years with the department, she'd never seen a group of people fight this hard for someone else's family. The garage was quiet. The space heater ticked. Outside, the deputy's cruiser backed down the gravel road, its red and blue lights painting the pine trees in alternating colors before disappearing into the darkness. Garrett sat down on the overturned crate. For the first time since Wade had known him, he looked his age. 58 years pressed into every line of his face, every gray hair, every tremor of the hand he rested on his knee. The authority was still there, structural and deep, but the weight it carried was visible now in a way it hadn't been before. "We should sleep," Garrett said. "Court's at 9. It's going to be a long day." Nobody slept. They took shifts instead, 2 men awake at all times, watching the gravel road and the tree line and the darkness that surrounded the clubhouse like deep water around a ship. Wade took the first shift with Briggs. They stood in the open bay door, smoking cigarettes and watching their breath fog in the frozen air and listening to a silence so complete that the creaking of pine branches in the wind sounded like conversation. At 2 a.m., Wade walked to the back room and opened the door quietly. Claire was asleep on the cot with Eli curled against her, the boy's face pressed into her shoulder, one small hand fisted in the fabric of her shirt. The space heater glowed orange in the corner. The room smelled like detergent and motor oil, and the particular warmth of 2 people holding each other through a night that neither of them had been sure they'd survive. Wade closed the door without making a sound and stood in the hallway for a long time, his back against the wall, his eyes closed, listening to the building breathe around him. At 4:30 a.m., his phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "This is Megan. Dad, I got your messages. All of them. I'm not ready to talk yet, but I'm listening. Don't stop calling." Wade read the message 7 times. Then he put the phone in his pocket and went back to the bay door where Briggs was lighting a fresh cigarette and the eastern sky was beginning to show the first gray suggestion of dawn. He didn't mention the text to anyone. Some things belonged to the silence. The courthouse in Lander was a sandstone building that sat on a block of frozen lawn, surrounded by the kind of small-town American architecture that looked timeless from a distance and tired up close. Catherine Voss, the attorney Dutch had found in Casper, was waiting on the steps when they arrived. She was younger than Wade had expected, mid-40s, with short, dark hair and the focused energy of someone who had built a career out of walking into rooms where the odds were stacked against her clients and dismantling those odds systematically. She'd reviewed the full evidence package. She'd spoken with Deputy Torres. And she'd received confirmation at 7:15 a.m. that the emergency protection order against Keith Raylan had been granted and served at his Cody residence at 6 a.m., where Raylan had been found still at home, apparently unable or unwilling to fulfill his promise to leave by morning. "He's been arrested," Voss told Claire on the courthouse steps. "Not for Mason's death. That investigation is being opened by DCY1, and it'll take time. But for violation of the protection order. He was served at 6 a.m. and was supposed to vacate immediately. Deputies returned at 6:45 to verify compliance and found him still in the house, bags packed, but not moving. He's being held at the county jail pending arraignment." Claire absorbed this standing on the courthouse steps in borrowed clothes, jeans and a sweater that Holt had found in the clubhouse supply closet, both too large, making her look smaller than she was. Eli stood beside her in his pajamas and sneakers, the only shoes he'd brought, holding his mother's hand with the quiet intensity of a child who understood that today was important, even if he didn't understand exactly why. "The custody petition?" Claire asked. "Withdrawn. His attorney filed the withdrawal at 11:30 last night. But we're proceeding with a counterfiling anyway. A formal motion for a permanent restraining order, full documentation of the abuse history, and a request for the court to seal any future custody petitions from Raylan pending the outcome of the criminal investigation." "How long will the investigation take?" "Months, maybe longer, but the break line evidence is strong, the letter is corroborated by the timeline, and DCY has already issued a request to impound Raylan's vehicle for forensic examination. They're looking for tool marks, blade fragments, metallic residue, anything that links a specific tool to the cut on the brake line. If they find a match—" Voss paused. "He'll be charged with murder." Claire nodded. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She stood on the courthouse steps in the cold morning air and looked at the sky, which had broken open overnight into the first clear blue that Black Hollow had seen in weeks. A sky so clean and sharp it looked like it had been washed, like the storm that had been pressing down on the valley for days had finally exhausted itself and moved on. "Thank you," she said to Voss. "Thank the men who brought me the evidence. I just know which forms to fill out." Claire looked back at the parking lot where Garrett's truck and Dutch's truck sat side by side in the visitor spaces. Wade was leaning against Garrett's truck, arms crossed, watching the courthouse entrance. Garrett was beside him. Holt was sitting on the tailgate of Dutch's truck, flexing his prosthetic hand against the cold. Briggs stood apart from the group, smoking, his massive frame throwing a shadow across the frozen pavement. They weren't watching the courthouse because they expected trouble. They were watching because it was what they did. Keeping watch. Standing post. Being present in the only way they knew how, physically, silently, with the particular stubbornness of men who had decided that this family belonged to them and would not be abandoned again. The hearing took 45 minutes. It was procedural, administrative, the legal equivalent of paperwork. The judge reviewed the protection order, accepted the custody petition withdrawal, granted Voss's motion for the permanent restraining order, and recommended that Claire contact victim services for additional support. He also noted, with the look that fell somewhere between concern and curiosity, the presence of 4 men in leather-adjacent clothing sitting in the gallery behind the petitioner's table. none of whom spoke or moved or did anything except exist with the controlled intensity of people who had been through something together and were not yet finished. After the hearing, they drove back to Black Hollow in convoy. Garrett's truck, Dutch's truck, Claire's Civic, which Holt had driven from the Garfield house that morning after checking the property for signs of intrusion and finding none. The caravan of vehicles moved through the highway like a small migration, heading north through landscape that was beginning to thaw under the first real sun in days. They stopped at Rosie's Diner on Main Street. Not because anyone was hungry, though everyone was, but because the diner was the kind of place where people went after something terrible and something important had happened simultaneously, and the only appropriate response was to sit in a booth and drink coffee and let the ordinariness of a laminated menu and a waitress who didn't care about your problems do the work of bringing you back to the surface. Eli ordered pancakes. He ate 3. Wade watched him eat and felt something unlock inside his chest that had been sealed for years. Not joy exactly, not relief, but the particular sensation of a man who has been holding his breath so long he's forgotten what exhaling feels like, and then remembers. Claire sat across from Garrett. They didn't speak for the first 10 minutes, just drank coffee. The diner's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and outside the window, the main street of Black Hollow looked the same as it always had. Tired, struggling, underfunded, the architecture of a town that refused to die even when every economic indicator said it should. "What happens now?" Claire asked. Garrett wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. The left one trembled. The right one steadied it. The balance between them, the damaged and the functional, the failing and the compensating, seemed to Wade like a metaphor for everything the club had ever been. "Now you go home," Garrett said. "To your house, your life. We fix whatever needs fixing. The porch, the window, the heater, the car. We cover the rent until you're stable. No terms, no conditions, no key." "For how long?" "For as long as it takes." "That could be a long time." "We've got time." Claire looked at her coffee, at the diner, at the men scattered across 2 booths and a counter stool, eating eggs and bacon and toast with the unselfconscious appetite of people who had been awake all night and were running on adrenaline and caffeine and the kind of stubborn physical endurance that came from years of riding through weather that should have stopped them. "Mason kept you away from us because he thought you were the danger," Claire said. "He thought the club, the rides, the lifestyle, the risk, was the thing that would hurt Eli. He never told you about us because he believed that separation was protection." She set her mug down. "He was wrong. The danger was never you. It was the person he trusted because they shared blood, and the protection, the real protection, was sitting in a garage 40 miles away the whole time, waiting to be called." Garrett didn't respond immediately. He looked at Eli, who was building a small fortress out of sugar packets on the diner table, his fingers moving with the careful precision of a boy who had inherited his father's mechanical instincts and his mother's determination to make something useful out of whatever materials were available. "Mason wasn't wrong," Garrett said quietly. "This life does carry risk. The road is dangerous. The freedom costs things that most people aren't willing to pay. He kept you separate because he loved you too much to let you see the full price." He paused. "But love without information is just another kind of cage. And Mason, for all his courage, for all his heart, built a cage around you out of silence and good intentions. And when he died, the cage stayed and the protection left." Claire's eyes were wet. She didn't wipe them. She let the tears sit on her cheeks like evidence of something she'd been holding back for so long that releasing it felt more like an act of structural engineering than emotion, a controlled demolition of walls that had outlived their purpose. "I want Eli to know you," she said. "All of you. I want him to know who his father rode with. I want him to learn engines and repairs and whatever else you can teach him. But I need it to be different from what Mason had. I need it to be open. No secrets, no separate lives. If Eli walks into that garage, I walk in with him." "Deal," Garrett said. "And I'm not joining anything. I'm not becoming a club member or an old lady or whatever the terminology is. I'm a nurse with a son who needs stability, and I will accept your help exactly as long as I need it, and not a day longer." "Also a deal." Claire almost smiled. The expression was tentative, experimental, the facial equivalent of testing weight on an injured leg. "Will it hold? Can I do this without it hurting?" It held. Eli looked up from his sugar packet fortress. "Can I learn to fix motorcycles?" he asked, directing the question at Wade with the directness of a 10-year-old who had not yet learned that important questions were supposed to be asked indirectly. Wade looked at Claire. Claire looked at Eli. Then she looked at the man who had walked into her kitchen at midnight and stood between her son and violence without being asked, who had ridden through 2 years of his own unresolved grief to answer a phone call from a child he'd met once in the rain. "Yeah," Claire said. "You can learn." Eli went back to his sugar packets, but his mouth curved upward, just slightly, just for a moment, and the expression was so purely Mason's that Wade had to look away and stare at his own coffee until the tightness in his throat subsided. They finished breakfast. They paid with cash that Garrett put down before Claire could reach for her wallet, and the look she gave him was equal parts annoyance and gratitude, which Wade figured was probably the healthiest combination available to a woman who had spent 2 years accepting help that came with hidden costs, and was still learning to accept help that didn't. Outside, the sun was full now, pale winter sun without warmth but with light. Enough light to see the mountains in the distance, and the pine trees on the ridgeline, and the road that led north to the clubhouse, and south to the house on Garfield Street, where the porch needed fixing, and the window needed glass, and the lock on the front door needed changing. They would fix all of it, today, tomorrow, however long it took. 6 years later, the clubhouse looked different. Not dramatically. The corrugated walls were still flat black, the gravel lot still crunched under tires. The garage bay still smelled like chain lube and burnt coffee. But there were additions. A covered patio on the south side, built by Dutch and Briggs over 2 weekends, where Claire set up a folding table in the summers, and the bikers ate meals she cooked on a grill that Holt had welded together from salvaged steel. A basketball hoop mounted above the bay door, slightly crooked, installed by Eli when he was 12 and never straightened because the crookedness had become a point of pride. A garden along the east wall, small, impractical, tended by Claire during her days off, that produced tomatoes and herbs and a surprising quantity of jalapenos that found their way into everything Briggs cooked when it was his turn to make dinner. The photograph of Mason still hung on the pegboard, but it wasn't alone anymore. Beside it were other photos: the club at a summer ride, Eli's first successful engine rebuild at 13, Claire laughing at something Dutch had said during a barbecue, Garrett sitting on his Electroglide with a paper cup of coffee, and the expression of a man who had found something he'd been looking for without knowing he was looking for it. Eli was 16 the spring he nearly destroyed everything. He'd been working in the garage for 6 years by then, apprenticing under Wade and Dutch, learning the language of machines the way his father had, through touch, through failure, through the patient repetition of disassembly and reassembly until the logic of engines became as natural as breathing. He was good. Better than good. He had Mason's hands and Mason's instinct and, unfortunately, Mason's arrogance, the particular confidence of a young man who believed he understood risk because he'd grown up around it, not realizing that proximity to danger and comprehension of danger were two entirely different things. The customer's Harley, a 2019 Road Glide brought in for a clutch rebuild, sat on the lift in the garage bay. Dutch was supposed to supervise the job, but had been called to a parts run in Riverton, leaving Eli alone with the bike and his own judgment. Eli finished the rebuild in 3 hours, didn't run the safety checks, didn't verify the clutch cable tension, didn't test the free play at the lever. He rolled the bike off the lift, started the engine, and took it out on the gravel road behind the clubhouse for a test ride that lasted 45 seconds before the clutch failed completely at 30 miles an hour, and the bike lurched forward uncontrollably, and Eli ditched it into the drainage ditch at the edge of the property. He wasn't hurt. The bike was scratched fairing, bent highway bar, damaged mirror, but the injuries to the machine were superficial compared to what could have happened. At highway speed on a public road with traffic, a clutch failure like that would have been a death sentence. The exact kind of mechanical failure that had killed Mason. Different system, same principle. A machine that should have been checked and wasn't. A failure that should have been caught and wasn't. A young man who trusted his own ability over established procedure and nearly paid for it. Wade found him in his garage 20 minutes later, standing over the damaged bike with grease on his face and the particular expression of a teenager who knows he's screwed and is trying to calculate the magnitude before anyone else arrives. What happened? Clutch cable. I must have set the tension wrong. It slipped and, "Did you run the safety checks?" Eli didn't answer, which was an answer. Wade's reaction was not measured. It was not calm. It was not the careful, controlled response of a mentor who understood that 16-year-olds made mistakes, and that mistakes were part of learning. It was the explosion of a man who had spent 6 years watching a dead friend's son grow into a version of the same reckless confidence that had made Mason brilliant and vulnerable in equal measure, and who had just watched that confidence nearly kill the boy on a gravel road 40 feet from where his father's wrecked motorcycle still sat on its steel frame. The wrench hit the workbench with a sound like a gunshot. The echo rang through the garage and bounced off the corrugated walls and didn't stop. It just kept ringing, layering over itself, filling the space with the metallic resonance of fury and fear compressed into a single violent action. You don't rush machines that can kill people. Wade's voice was cracked and raw. The voice of a man speaking through a throat constricted by something that wasn't anger, though it sounded like anger, though it wore anger's face and used anger's volume. That arrogance buried your father. Do you understand that? The same exact impulse. I know better. I don't need the checklist. I can feel when it's right. That impulse put your father under a truck on a mountain highway. And you just took it out for a ride on a bike you didn't bother to check. Eli stood motionless. The words hit him the way Wade's words always hit. Not as punishment, but as excavation, digging through layers of adolescent confidence to the bedrock underneath. The place where the boy understood that what Wade was saying was true, and that the truth was worse than the yelling. "Take it apart," Wade said. "What?" "The clutch. Take it apart. Every component, every cable, every plate, every spring. Lay them out on the bench in order, then put it back together, correctly, and don't stop until it's done." Eli looked at the bike, at the damage, at the clock on the wall that read 4:15 p.m. This would take all night. "Okay," he said. He started working. Wade pulled the overturned crate to the corner of the garage. His crate, the same one he'd been sitting on since the night he first came back from the gas station with a dead friend's name echoing in his skull, and sat down. He didn't help. He didn't instruct. He didn't speak. He just sat there, boots heavy on the concrete, a cup of coffee in his hands going cold, watching a 16-year-old boy take a machine apart piece by piece and learn the lesson that Mason never lived long enough to teach him. The hours passed. Snow began to fall outside. Late spring snow, heavy and wet, the kind that covered everything in silence and made the world look new. It pounded against the warehouse windows in thick clusters that slid down the glass in slow trails. The garage lights hummed. The space heater ticked. Eli worked with his hands steady and his face set in concentration, the mask of a young man doing something that mattered for reasons he was only beginning to understand. At 3 a.m., he finished. The clutch was rebuilt, every cable tensioned to spec, every plate aligned, every spring seated correctly. He ran the safety checks, all of them, every line item, the full procedure that Dutch had taught him years ago and that he'd skipped because he thought he was good enough to skip it. He stepped back from the bike. His hands were trembling. Not from cold, but from 8 hours of sustained precision work, the kind that demanded everything from muscles and focus and left nothing in reserve. Wade stood up from the crate. He walked to the bike, inspected the rebuild without speaking, pulling the clutch lever, checking the cable tension, verifying the free play with the mechanical thoroughness of a man who had been doing this work since before Eli was born. It was perfect. Wade placed his hand on Eli's shoulder. Not as a biker teaching mechanics, not as a mentor correcting a student. As a man who had been given a second chance to do the thing he'd failed to do with his own child, to be present, to be honest, to stand beside someone young and frightened and say without words, "I'm not going anywhere. Not this time. Never again." Eli didn't speak. He leaned into the weight of Wade's hand the way a structure leans into a support beam, not collapsing, not surrendering, but accepting that some loads are meant to be shared. They stood like that for a long time in the garage at 3 a.m., snow falling outside, the wrecked ghost of Mason's Harley watching from its frame against the wall, the photograph on the pegboard grinning down at a son who was becoming the man his father had wanted to be, but never quite managed. Years later, more years than any of them had expected, because time moves differently when you stop running from it. The clubhouse had become something that none of them would have predicted and all of them needed. Not an outlaw hideout, not a clubhouse, a home. The kind of home that isn't defined by walls or addresses, but by the agreement of damaged people to keep showing up for each other until showing up becomes as involuntary as breathing. Garrett's tremor had worsened. He rode less, managed more, spent his mornings in the office with coffee and paperwork and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had built something that would outlast him. Holt had reconnected with his ex-wife, not romantically, but with the careful, rebuilt civility of two people who had hurt each other enough to understand that forgiveness was not an event, but a practice. Dutch still ran the shop. Briggs still spoke rarely and meant everything he said. Claire had been promoted twice at the hospital. She'd gone back to school, nights, weekends, between shifts, and earned a nurse practitioner certification that doubled her salary and halved her hours and allowed her to spend afternoons at the clubhouse, where the garden she'd planted had expanded to cover the entire east wall and produced enough vegetables to feed every person who walked through the bay door. And Wade had called Megan. Not once, not 60 times, but consistently, steadily, the way a man rebuilds a bridge, one plank at a time, tested before the next one is placed, never rushing, never assuming the structure will hold until it proves that it can. She'd answered on the fourth call. They'd talked for 11 minutes. The next call lasted 20. The one after that, an hour. She came to Wyoming the following spring. A visit, not a reconciliation, though the line between those things blurred more with each subsequent visit, until one day she showed up with a suitcase instead of a weekend bag, and neither of them mentioned the difference. On a warm Saturday afternoon in late spring, Eli Mercer, 19 years old, grease under his fingernails, his father's stubborn jaw, and his mother's steady eyes, knelt beside a younger kid in the garage. The kid was 12. His name was Marcus. His father had died in a construction accident the previous year, and his mother had brought him to the clubhouse because someone at the hospital where Claire worked had told her about a group of men who helped families that the system had forgotten. Eli showed Marcus how to gap a spark plug, patiently, carefully, the way Wade had shown him, the way Mason never got the chance to. Claire stood in the garage doorway watching. Behind her, the covered patio held the remnants of a lunch that Briggs had cooked and everyone had eaten. Beyond the patio, the gravel lot held a row of Harleys gleaming in the afternoon sun. And beyond the lot, the mountains rose into a sky so blue it looked painted, the kind of sky that Wyoming produces when it wants to remind you that beauty and harshness are not opposites, but partners, two sides of the same landscape, inseparable and permanent. A Harley rumbled to life somewhere in the lot, then another. The sound rolled across the property like low thunder, the same sound that had terrified Claire on a rainy night at a gas station years ago, the sound she had associated with danger and death and the leather-clad strangers who had taken her husband from her. She listened to it now and felt something she hadn't expected and couldn't name precisely, though it lived in the same region of her chest where grief had resided for so long that she'd assumed the space would always belong to pain. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't peace. It was something more honest than either. The recognition that the world was still hard, and the scars were still visible, and the people she loved were still damaged in ways that would never fully heal, but that they were here, present, showing up, doing the work of staying when everything in their histories had taught them to leave. The engines idled in the sunlight. Eli's voice carried from the garage, patient and steady, guiding a 12-year-old's hands through the small, precise movements of a task that didn't matter at all and mattered enormously. The act of teaching someone younger that broken things could be fixed, that machines responded to care, that the world would hand you tools if you were willing to learn how to use them. Claire turned from the doorway and walked back to the patio where Garrett was sitting with his coffee, his trembling hand resting on the table beside a photograph he'd been carrying in his wallet. Not Mason, but his own daughter, the one he'd lost to illness 6 years before all of this began. He looked up when Claire sat down. Neither of them spoke. The sun moved across the table between them, warm and indifferent, illuminating the scratches on the old wood surface like a map of everywhere they'd been. The scars never vanished. The grief never disappeared completely. But somewhere between the roaring engines, the late-night diner coffee, and the silent loyalty of men in leather jackets who had failed everyone they loved and refused to fail again, somewhere in that space, The Mercer family had found the thing that Mason had died trying to protect, and Keith Raylan had spent years trying to steal. Not safety. Safety was temporary. Not justice. Justice was slow and imperfect and arrived in courtrooms where people in suits argued over paperwork. Home. The kind that sounds like thunder when it arrives and stays long after the storm passes.